Okay, so let's start, and I'll start in. We're extremely happy to be here this morning with Floyd Kvamme, who is a semiconductor industry pioneer who is so experienced in marketing of high-tech companies, but probably is best known for his work at Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield and Byers, and his work in policy and science and technology on behalf of the entire country. So we have a lot to talk about this morning. Thank you, Floyd.
Hey, you're very welcome.
So let's start with right at the very beginning, your personal background, your upbringing and education.
Sure. I was born and raised in San Francisco. My parents were immigrants from Norway, and my dad was a carpenter. My mother was a homemaker, and then did some domestic work outside the home to earn a living. I would say we were lower middle class folks. Lived in the Sunset when I first remember. I was born at Mary's Health Hospital in San Francisco, but then we moved to 29th Avenue in the Sunset, the row homes that are out there. My dad had been a carpenter working on those, and went to Lawton School there in the Sunset Public School. And right down the street from us on 29th Avenue at Moraga was a playground. So I spent a lot of my early years there. I loved to play baseball, football. I was taught those sports by a director at that playground, Barney Greenberg, who passed away some years ago, I heard. I had no contact with him after as a kid, but my parents didn't really know anything about American athletics because my dad was just a really hard worker. An important part of our family was church. We were very active in our church. I had medals from perfect attendance every Sunday for years running. Then in the 7th grade, my dad had joined Dolger, who built Westlake, just south of San Francisco. And so we became one of the first residents of Westlake in 1949. And so I went to school then at Jefferson Middle School, or junior high, whatever you'd call it, and finally at Jefferson High School, where I would have liked to have gone out for athletics, but my brother and I carried newspapers in the morning. I had my first paper out when I was 9, 24th Avenue in San Francisco, and my brother and I then built up a paper out in Daly City for the San Francisco Examiner. We carried up to 600 papers a morning, got up 3:45 in the morning, but that's the money that allowed me to go to college, frankly. I started to save very early on because actually I would help my folks do their income tax because they didn't quite understand the forms from the time I was like 13 or 14. So I knew there was no money. I mean, there was no money for anything but going to school. And I loved mathematics. And I thought, that's what I'll be. I'll be a math teacher because that's what I saw. And a high school English teacher, actually, his name was Thomas Redman, took a liking to me, and he said, Floyd, do you know what engineering is? And I said, no. He said, engineering is applied mathematics. I said, well, that's interesting. So what does an engineer do? And of course, he didn't exactly know, but we didn't have counselors in schools that much in those days. This is the early 50s now. And so he encouraged me to think about engineering. And so I decided that I would find out what the math was. And I learned that the hardest math was in EE, electrical engineering. So I decided I'll become an electrical engineer, and if it doesn't work, I can always go down. And by that time on the job, I was working for my dad every available minute when I was away from school as an apprentice carpenter. And so I could afford this stuff. And that happened all the way through college, as a matter of fact, but it started late in high school. And I learned that mathematics was the part in electrical engineering. By that time, I'd met some civil engineers on the job, but they were mostly running backhoes and that kind of stuff. And so I decided that I would try and get into Berkeley. I remember the test that we were given. The guy got up in front and said, only 1 of 10 of you will make it into our freshman class, but don't be discouraged. You can go 2 years to a different school or community college, and then perhaps transfer in as a junior. Well, fortunately, I was one of the fortunate ones to be able to get into Cal, and started there in '55 in electrical engineering, and really enjoyed it. And the math was great. And in those days, double E at Cal was very, very heavily oriented toward physics. It wasn't a very practical program, but you really learned, how electronics worked and how radiography worked and all these kinds of things. Well, there were the odd seminars in the late afternoon that were applying this stuff. One of those was, or on occasion, they would have ones on semiconductors. Semiconductors were a very new thing. And they fascinated me, that you could get this performance out of a piece of silicon, or germanium primarily in those days. And so I went to all those. But I decided that as that time grew to a close, as I was getting my degree, that I really didn't know what engineers did actually in the real world. So rather than go on to any master's program, I'd go work as an engineer for at least a year and decide, whether this was something I really wanted to do.
This was after you finished Cal?
No, I was in the process of finishing Cal. So I interviewed, and in 1959 there were a lot of job opportunities for engineers, and I think I got job offers from like 20 different companies.
Was it all in semiconductors? No,
it was all in various aspects of electronics. But the one that was that had semiconductor design in it, it was a little company in Ventura, California. And I reasoned that if I went to a small company, I could see a broad number of things get done. And this company was founded by two German scientists who had come over with von Braun in Operation Paperclip, if you've ever heard of that term. And Theodor Sturm and Otto Schwede. One guy, Sturm, once told me of a meeting he had with Hitler, actually on the V2 rocket, because he was part of that project, in fact. But they were brilliant guys, particularly Theo. He was a brilliant circuit designer.
For purposes of the record, we probably ought to get you to spell Sturm and Schwede.
Yeah, okay. S-C-H-W-E-D-E, and Sturm was S-T-U-R-M, Theodor and Otto. So anyway, I went in and did transistor design there, and I said, this stuff's amazing. And there were the inklings of integrated circuits by that time. They had just been invented really 2 years before that. So I said, I got to do my master's work in semiconductors. So I wrote to, as I recall, about 30 colleges and universities around the United States trying to find a master's program in semiconductors. And the only two that existed, one was at Purdue and one was at Syracuse. The one at Purdue was there because the Naval Air Development Center in Crane, Indiana had discovered the transistor effect like 3 weeks after Shockley. And obviously being second is not a good thing. And the one at Syracuse was there because GE Semiconductor was in town, and they had they sponsored the program at Syracuse.
And there was a lot of work in semiconductors being done at GE or transistors, I'd say. Not
transistors, right? Yeah.
The transistors through the 50s.
That's correct. In the latter, they had started the division in the mid 50s, something like that. And so I joined them in 1960, and I worked full time because we didn't have any money. And as soon as I graduated from college, 10 days later, I married Jean, and we immediately moved to Ventura, and then we moved to Syracuse. And she worked while we were in Ventura to make ends meet, and so we then were off to Syracuse. And
did you have any misgivings about leaving California and going all the way across the country to?
Not that many. I mean, obviously we're leaving family, but what I didn't point out was between my junior and senior year, because my folks were from a foreign country, we got a lot of mail from Norway. And so I was a stamp collector from the time I was, in the 4th grade or something like that. I remember getting all the first day covers, if you know what those are, where you'd send in an envelope and pay the price, and they'd send you the letter back with the stamp on it. I have every first day cover from 1948, I believe, in my collection someplace. I don't even know where the collection is today. But I had a huge interest in geography and travel. And my brother and I had gone to Norway between our junior and senior year. My brother, who was older than me, 17 months older than me, he had pneumonia as a very young boy. So he was held back in school, and as a result, we went to the same grade all from about the 6th grade on. And many people thought we were twins. We were not, but they thought we were twins. And so anyway, at Berkeley, I decided that I'd work, and so I worked that year. Worked on mostly programs from Point Mugu missile range, because in Ventura, these scientists had these tracking programs and all. Went to GE, and parallel, I did all my master's work at night, and so I was busy. I mean, I was taking 9 units and working full time.
So you're working full time at GE,
yeah,
and then getting your master's.
Yeah, and GE had a program that they just started there, which was kind of a fast training program for new engineers in semiconductors, and they moved you, every 6 months you moved to a different assignment. Well, I moved into applications engineering, which wrote the GE transistor manual, which I was showing you earlier.
That's really neat.
This is this was the Bible for semiconductor designers in 1960, 61, 62, 63, and this happens to be the last version that was ever made, 64. But my master's thesis is in here on how you know how fast the transistor switches from the on to the off state, and how do you design a semiconductor amplifier, a transistor amplifier. How do you figure out what the values of the resistors are, how much output you want, and I wrote those chapters and all. And so
now, what year did you graduate from Cal?
59.
59.
Went to Syracuse in 60.
Okay.
Graduated with a master's in 62.
And this manual existed at GE while you were there?
That's correct. It got thicker and thicker and thicker, and they produced this one after I left, this last version, and sent me a copy, and still, called me one of the authors of it. But it was a very, very, I don't know how many of these they printed, but it was a lot, and everybody wanted the transistor manual because it was such the transistor was such a new thing. So.
And what was your master's thesis on?
It was on charge analysis of semiconductor switches, namely we use the charge equation, or develop charge parameters to show how quickly would a transistor turn on or turn off. And of course, in those days, there were many different types of transistors. We had lots of germanium types and a few silicon types. Silicon wasn't that common when I did that work. But I showed in the thesis how the different constructions of transistors had different switching times and why. We analyzed all that in the thesis.
Was it clear at that point, as you were doing that research, was it clear to you the relative limitations of germanium, for example, or relative to other materials?
Because germanium, it was not possible to build an oxide layer on top of it, so it was pretty clear that wasn't going to be integrated circuits. And GE, while I was there, got involved in ECL, as a matter of fact, emitter coupled logic. As a matter of fact, many years later, I got this call from some lawyers, and GE and Motorola were arguing about the ECL patents. And it turned out the first publication they could find on ECL I had written as an application note in 1961, I believe. And ECL was very, very fast. It had a lot of problems, but it was very fast for computer usage. And the fact that all the collectors tied to one region, it was easy to make from an integrated circuit point of view. So that's why it was popular.
And what was the environment like in those days? A lot of young engineers experimenting, trying new things. And
trying to build new things. Of course, radios were being built. And then, of course, there was the fact that the space program was starting. And in 57 or 58, the Christmas of those years, I'd been interviewed by the Ford Foundation, which was trying to figure out how do you make an engineer? How do we get more of them? That old story that's gone on for decades now. And so I'd gotten interested in how that was all progressing also, and being interviewed about how, what made people interested in electronics or interested in engineering. But it was exciting, and there was all kinds of new applications, and the building of computers with this was just starting. But the Polaris missile was in the design phases. It didn't get big until I joined Fairchild later. but you know, satellites they couldn't use, you know, vacuum tubes. That was not totally impractical, so they were using transistor designs on circuit boards at that time. So anyway, did the master's thesis. And I would have stayed at GE for a while because I liked it. I liked the guys there. It was fun. I was traveling around the country giving lectures on how semiconductors worked at all kinds of companies and introducing them to this new thing. And early integrated circuits were starting to come out, logic families, the ECL family, the RTL family, resistor transistor logic. But they had a policy that that if I didn't have a marketing degree, I couldn't be in marketing at GE. So I said, you know, I'm kind of enjoying. And applications was in marketing. It was a really strange policy, and so I decided, you know, maybe I better get back and go back into the design world.
So that's interesting. You were drawn into the marketing side of it as well as the engineering side.
That's correct, and because I you know. I don't know. I mean, people said I was very good at explaining things with simple analogies, and trying to get people to understand what was going on in a transistor, so that they could you know, use it. So I started to look around, coming back to the coast, and we decided to move back, and I joined Space Technology Labs as a circuit designer. And the reason they wanted me, they actually found me because they saw some of my writings. I had given talks at the very early solid state circuits conference was held in Philadelphia every year. And I'd given a couple of talks there by then with my GE hat on. And so they approached me and wanted me to join them for a big program that they had just won the contract on. So we decided to move back to California because my next assignment in GE was going to be, I can't remember, something in manufacturing, and it wasn't interesting either. So we left GE and came back to Manhattan Beach and STL. And as we were transiting the country, some political thing came up, and the contract was taken away from STL that I'd been hired for to run the engineering thing on. And I was pretty young at that time. I was like, what, 24, something like that, 25. Born in 37.
What year would this have been?
62.
1962.
Yeah, because I was born in late 37, so I was 23 at the time. 61, yeah, 24 at the time. So we got there, and they said, you know, we got some good news and some bad news. The contract is not ours. It was going to AC Milwaukee, AC Spark in Milwaukee. But we really want you to work for us, and we're going to put you into this orbiting geophysical observatory project that we do have as a design engineer. And I said, okay, that wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but that was fine. And good group of guys designing this project. But as a result of being there, of course, the salesmen from the different semiconductor companies were calling on me to try to make sure that I designed in their products. And of course, I knew a lot about the GE products. But the Fairchild salesman was a particularly persuasive guy. His name was Chaz Haba. As a matter of fact, he came to the Fairchild 50-year anniversary here. I hadn't seen him in years and years and years. And Chaz kept introducing me to the guys up in Mountain View. And to make a long story short, they made me an offer to join the product marketing team because I kept correcting Chaz's pitch on how transistors really worked, because the salesmen in those days were not 100% trained. They weren't, you know, engineers. They were engineers, but they weren't engineers with semiconductor training. So I joined Fairchild in 1963, April of '63, in product marketing and integrated circuit product marketing, because they had a guy, Ben Annixter, who you may have met, was running discrete transistors. And my job was to define circuits for circuit families for Fairchild, and to work on the custom programs that they had, and work with those companies in designing the kinds of circuits that they would need. All the development was done at Fairchild R&D up in Palo Alto, and that was run, of course, by Gordon Moore at that time. So I got to go know Gordon very, very well. Of course, you know, very few months after I was there, early '63, I remember one day sitting in Gordon's office going over our weekly review, and somebody sticks their head in the door that John Kennedy had been shot. So I know exactly where I was. I was in a circuit design review, and we were stunned. I remember the impact on all of us was quite remarkable. But the large computer companies in those days each designed their own chip that they wanted the manufacturer to design. It was before the day when they automatically adopted the manufacturer's designs, although that transition was taking place during that period of time. And you know, since I was working with a lot of the large customers, the SDSs and the CDCs and the IBMs and all, I got to know the management pretty well. Tom Bay was running marketing. I reported to a guy named Bob Graham, who has passed away since, but he was a very popular guy initially, and then later on I reported to Jerry Sanders within Fairchild. Matter of fact, when we left, I was still reporting to Jerry. But so we developed some circuit families. We worked with a lot of companies on developing their products. And the fascinating thing about Fairchild was, as the semiconductor division grew, we would turn in our month-end results and our quarterly results, and then Fairchild Camera and Instrument, which we were a division of, would announce their quarterly results. And by 65, 66, the profits at Camera and Instrument were always greater than whatever Fairchild Camera and Instrument was reporting. Namely, everything else was losing money was the bottom line. And so I got a phone call in actually Christmas Eve, 1966, and Charlie Spork was putting together a team to go off and you know, start our own company, because he was general manager at that time. And actually, there's a funny story about how I'd met Charlie, because Fairchild also had this same idea that you had to have had sales experience before you could advance in marketing. So after I'd been working there as a product marketing engineer for a very short time, they transferred me back to Boston to work on the Apollo computer, the Poseidon, and the Polaris at MIT Instrumentation Labs as a sales engineer. And so and the MIT folks were designing the Apollo computer at this time. And Raytheon was having real trouble in manufacturing. And I wrote this long memo to the Coast about all their problems that they're having. And it took me years to live this line down. I finished the memo by saying, remember, on Apollo, the customer is asking for the moon. And that was yeah, we know, Floyd, they're asking for the moon, you know.
That's a great line.
You know, I thought about it like it's 2 a.m. in the morning, you know, and I was sending off this, you know, report and why they needed help. So Charlie came out there. It was a snowy day, and helped them build, you know, showed them the half marriages that and how the Apollo computer. Well, you have it out here, but how it was physically put together. And they had a weld splash problem, it turned out.
Now, why was it being built out there?
Well, Raytheon had the contract to build the Apollo computer. It was being designed by MIT Instrumentation Lab on Cambridge Parkway there. And so I called on those guys, and then I called on the folks to make sure they used our circuits in it, because we had a competitor. Both Raytheon itself, semiconductor division, was building that part, and TI was building that part. So there's three of us trying to get the logic business for the Apollo computer. And we were very fortunate in getting a large share of that business. But so that's kind of how I had met Charlie, although I didn't report to him at all. So it was odd to get this phone call. I'm obviously leaving out a lot of details. There's a lot of funny stories there. But on Christmas Eve, 1966, and it's Charlie, and he wanted me to come over to his house. He was putting together a team to go join Plessey. And we were going to resign the day after New Year's in 1967. And so we went up to, and he was going to have a meeting with the guys from Plessey. We were going to move to England and take things over there. And he, so we were all, the group of us were sitting at a restaurant across the street, and Charlie was negotiating the final details with Sir John Clark, and Michael Clark, I guess was his name, the guy who was running Plessey at the time. And Charlie comes back across the street, and I think it was actually New Year's Day evening, and comes across the street and says, can't make a deal. These guys, this isn't going to work. We don't want to do this. We're going to go back to work tomorrow. We work at Fairchild. We're going to be loyal Fairchild employees, and it's not going to work.
Do you know why it broke down?
It had to do with what the compensation details were going to be, particularly the stock ownership kind of thing. Because, of course, by that time, the Valley was, everybody at Fairchild had a stock option, including the secretary. I mean, 100% of the employees. And so ownership was a very key thing. We didn't care about the salaries that much, but what percentage were we going to get, and what percentage would we have for the employees? And I think that was so foreign. Charlie would know the exact answer, of course. I've actually forgotten. But it had to do with that. So we went back to work the next day, and that was it. Well, 6 weeks passed, and I get another call from Charlie. He says there's a struggling company that had hired Bob Weidler and Dave Talbot called National Semiconductor out here down in Santa Clara. And they want to bring us in. They'll move the company from Danbury, Connecticut, although we'll keep the operation there and we'll be the management team. So went over there, and sure enough, the next Monday morning, that was also, I think, on a Sunday. So I always had a lot of time to decide these things. And Don Lucas was the originator of that whole idea. He was on the national board, the Don Lucas of Oracle fame, and et cetera, et cetera. And so he put the deal together. Peter Sprague was the chairman of National at that time, but he was off in Spain someplace. And he was all in favor of it, though. So joined National.
And was it, it was just common, wasn't it, at that point for talented engineers or groups of engineers to leave Fairchild as a block?
No, I think we were the first.
You were the first?
There had been a few small groups, but after us then, AMD formed, Intel formed, a number of other things formed. But in the very early days of Fairchild, that had happened. But there hadn't been a spin out in a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, by the time we started that. We kind of started that avalanche.
And was it clear to you at that point that was, for you personally, that was just a better way forward than staying at Fairchild? Or?
Well, Charlie was very convincing on that front because, he saw the numbers. And he said, it's silly. There's so much opportunity, and they making less money as a total corporation than we were making. It was not capital intensive at that time. As a matter of fact, when we first started at National, we built a brand new diffusion line, a wafer processing line, and the capital cost was $1 million. Today it's $4 billion, $5 billion, I mean, it was nothing. But we saw that was starting to happen. And if you didn't have retained earnings, you weren't going to succeed in this business. And so he just wasn't happy with what the Syosset, the headquarters, was doing. And I frankly don't know how all the negotiations took place or what he tried to do to change before that. Because by that time, Bob Noyce had become president of the company, but he wasn't chairman. Sherman Fairchild and then another guy, what was his name, was also, a guy named Dick Hodgson was also in that upper ranks there at Fairchild. But the company was, it wasn't going to work. Now, up until that time, essentially all the companies had, all the semiconductor companies had large corporate parents. I mean, Raytheon was like that. I guess Signetics was independent at that time, and then they, of course, later became involved with others. But I mean, Motorola, Texas Instrument had been a long-term company that was in the mining equipment business and all. So all the companies had, all the big companies had corporate parents that weren't just they weren't pure semiconductor companies. And we may have been one of the first that was going to build a big company purely from semiconductors. And then, of course, like I said, there was the avalanche of AMD and Intel, et cetera.
Right. So this was new for you to spin out of Fairchild as a group?
Yeah, I think it was pretty new. I mean, it had happened before. Baldwin and some of those guys that had spun out before I arrived at Fairchild in '63 had happened, but they had not been very successful. None of those other, Ream was not very successful, those. And what we saw was this thing that I talked about earlier, springs, levers, stepping motors, and gears. We saw that there was a transition taking place, that there was a huge industrial market. We didn't think that we were big enough, and we knew we weren't big enough to supply the big computer companies. But we knew the mil-aero marketplace and the evolving industrial marketplace were going to start adopting semiconductors. And so our whole approach was to sell through distribution to this large industrial base. We didn't think we would be big in the big TV guys who were starting to adopt semiconductors at that time, and had during the mid-60s. But we saw this emerging industrial base plus the military. And of course, in those days, mil-aero applications were probably 40% of the business, something of that order, by the time you got the different missile systems and those kinds of things. The missile systems were, of course, the big ones. The space ones were more the recognition of the quality of your product kinds of deals. The volumes were ending up not being that large there. So my first job at National was heading up product planning, product marketing. What are we going to build? And also some engineering. I hired the first digital engineers because Bob Weidler was over there in the analog. And then I became head of marketing and sales probably within the next 2 years, and then general manager in like '72. And we grew very rapidly. I mean, as I recall our numbers, when we took it over, it was a $5 million company losing a lot of money. Our first quarter there, we were profitable, but we went from 5 to 11 to 33 to 99 to 213 million. I mean, it grew very, very rapidly, and it was heading for the $1 billion thing.
So your strategy worked, this initial strategy of supplying to people who were replacing other components with semiconductors.
That's right, and doing a lot of seminars. We traveled the world with seminars. At that time, we had the largest technical seminar ever held in the country of Sweden. The largest one I mean, Bob Weidler was by this time a phenom. He was the Steve Jobs of the early '70s, really. Everybody wanted to hear from him. How do you design circuits? And he did the linear stuff, I did the digital stuff. Sometimes a guy named Dale Mrazek came on the digital stuff as well to share it. And we taught people how to use silicon in all these applications. And it just took off. Lots of application notes, lots of that kind of stuff. And when I became general manager then down here, we had 9,000 people in Santa Clara. People don't remember how big those fab operations were. Matter of fact, one of the things I did that was really kind of wild was that I used to like to have lunch with 20 frontline workers every week, just to figure out what's going on in the factory. I found it a very valuable thing to know what was going on, because we got that many people. You don't know everybody. You just so reports filter up. But I wanted to know what was going on the ground floor. And it was very clear that a lot of our people were foreign-born, and I could relate to those folks. That's the kind of family I grew up in, where the language wasn't, there was an accent involved and all those kinds of things. And they had real trouble understanding what are all these pieces that we're building going into. So we started a real program of trying to educate them. In our cafeteria, we do displays of automobile, what parts we were doing in those things. I remember then one year we were planning on the company picnic, which was, as the company got larger, we had to go down to like Uvis Meadows, and 1,000 people would show up, and probably 500 of them didn't work for us because there was free food and all. And we decided, why don't we have a picnic at the plant? Because we had just taken over the 44 acres there in Santa Clara and hadn't developed our other buildings. And we'll invite the folks to bring their family and show them where they work. And then do some displays about what we build and this kind of stuff. 23,000 people showed up.
That's amazing.
People were just so thrilled to be able to show their family what they did for a living. And it really spoke volumes to me, because I suddenly realized, here I was raised in the family of a carpenter, and I could see what my dad did. I knew my dad built that house and this building and those houses and this kind of thing. And I realized that kids in modern families, many of them didn't have that opportunity. As the tech revolution came by, they disappeared into these buildings, and particularly if they were working on government work, they couldn't even talk about it at home. And I personally believe part of the breakdown of the family is related to that problem. in our society. I really do personally believe that. And so we did everything we could to inform people of what they were working on so they could be proud of it.
Well, and even if it wasn't secret, it was an invisible thing.
It was an invisible thing.
Something else that
they went into this tilt-up building, and then I started to bring this to Southeast Asia plants, because we had about 20,000 people in Southeast Asia building all these little bugs. You remember what ICs looked like. I didn't know what they were used for, so we tried to take all the popular examples out and give our factory managers, input on what these things were used for, so people could relate to their jobs.
And how did that work?
People loved it. They just thought, this is terrific, and they felt part of it. I mean, by the time I left the Semiconductor division, we probably had 20 or 30 pieces of silicon in every new car. And people related to that, and they related to the missile stuff. And by that time also we were building things like calculator chips and those kinds of things. So that was a big deal.
Now Weidler was a real character.
He was a real character, and sadly had a real drinking problem. And but he and I just got along famously. For some reason, I was not a drinker at all, but we had a real bond of trust. And he didn't like meetings. He didn't like it. So learning what he was actually working on was talent. I remember when we first started National, he had developed a voltage regulator, and in the field, people were just popping it all the time. It was like a fuse in the circuit. It wasn't working, And I'm trying to figure out how to get Bob to focus on something that was a little easier to use. And so one day, candidly, I walk into the urinal, and Bob's standing at the adjacent urinal. And I tell him, hey, Bob, you know what the world needs? It needs a part where there's an input lead from an regulated voltage, an output lead that's 5 volts, and a ground lead. 3 leads, man, that'd be their nirvana. About a year later, he walks into my office, puts these parts on the table, and says, "Is this what you're asking me about?" I had no idea he was even working on it, and nobody did. He didn't talk to people about what he was working on, but he was doing better amplifiers, better regulators, better voltage standards, and this kind of stuff. And on these conferences, he was what everybody wanted to listen to. And he was also very good with customers. And he realized that they always asked the same questions. So they'd get a long letter back from him answering their questions. And they were thrilled. I mean, I just got a 2-page, 3-page letter from Bob Weidler. Well, what he had was, he had developed a paragraph for every kind of problem. And he had about 20 of these standard paragraphs. And he'd tell his secretary, okay, and start it with, intro. And he had an intro thing. Dear so-and-so, glad to hear from you. I realize you're having problems. Here are some things I think you ought to think about. Then do paragraph 6, 8, and 14. Love Bob. Not love, but whatever. And people thought the guy was just, writing all this for him. So all the letters largely looked differently, but the paragraphs were the same in these things. I mean, the guy was amazing.
And he could churn them out quickly.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Template.
Oh, absolutely. He had a template for him. That's what he did.
Now, did it ever occur to you, as you were doing both product marketing and engineering, did it ever occur to you, I don't have any formal marketing training. I mean, I think it says a lot about someone who could build a paper route of that size as a boy. You obviously knew something about customer service and building customers.
Yeah.
How did you come to your kind of natural expertise in marketing?
Well, selling, to distinguish from marketing, I mean, my brother and I hawked newspapers at the last Joe Louis fight in the Cow Palace when we were like 12. I sold a lot, and we hawked newspapers in front of grocery stores up in Westlake, and our boss brought us through the Stonestown Towers to solicit new folks. One of the things that was probably my mother used to joke with me about this. Westlake was just developing, and when my dad, he became the foreman on the foundation, and at the peak they were building 8 foundations a day of new homes, and but he knew when people were moving in, because they report when the house had to be finished. Now, he was not in the finish, but they'd post it. And so when we started with the Examiner in Westlake, there were virtually no homes there, hardly, but there were a number of homes that were growing like crazy. Well, my dad would bring home the list of new homes so I could call on them. And after a little while of that, I said to my boss, you know what, Harold and I will do, my brother's name was Harold. He's deceased now. But what we'll do is, we'll deliver, if you'll give us 30 days worth of papers that I don't have to buy from you, because you bought papers, you know, and that's how the transaction worked for a newsboy. We'll deliver them 30 days free to every person that moves into Westlake, and then call them on the 30th day and see if they want to subscribe to it by that time. Man, it worked like a charm. We had over 50% of the new homes in Westlake taking the San Francisco Examiner at that time. I mean, it was and their density of circulation in San Francisco was like 16%, as I recall the numbers. Well, we had 50, and that's why they wanted us to call on it. But the secret was this free sample. And my dad had access to all the new folks moving in. So as soon as they moved in, the next day they moved in their house, they had a San Francisco Examiner sitting on their doorstep the next morning. And then as the thing grew, we would peel off routes for other boys to take, but we took all the new territory, because besides I got 50 cents a piece for every new subscription I got. So I not only got the business, but I got a bonus for the subscription. So that's how that started. So I guess there was some. Now my brother was not good at that. He didn't like that. He was a hard worker, and also he had no problem delivering the papers, and then he'd come back and find me. I had a terrible problem. I could actually fall asleep on that paper route standing up, and he'd come racing back a reverse direction trying to find me. I'd be in the middle of a street or middle of a sidewalk, because we walked it because we had such density. It didn't make sense to use a bicycle. So anyway, I don't know if that answered.
3:30 in the morning.
Yeah, quarter to 4.
Do this.
Quarter to 4 until 6.
So I'm just wondering if this kind of, that experience at an early age just developed this aptitude for being able to talk to.
I also like to teach.
Customers.
I also like to teach, and what I found was good marketing people. Many times, a good marketing person has an interest in teaching, because in some respects, in the technical world, that's what you're doing. And people love to learn, and they have great respect for those from whom they learn, usually. And so if you can turn your job into a teaching experience, not a selling experience, there's a great benefit to that. And I mean, frankly, what I decided very early on, and I'll have to admit that this had some of my religious background melded into it, if my part wasn't the right part for their application, I'd tell them that. I'd say, I really don't have the right thing for you. You really ought to be using this one. We're coming in that direction, and when we're there, I'm going to try to get the business back. But you ought to. And so if you train them and you built that trust thing with folks, it was really very valuable. Because again, even through the 70s, the understanding of these circuits was not real high as far as some of their actual application. But so anyway, to continue the story, we did that, and semiconductors were just permeating computing and calculating, and by that time the personal computer was starting to bubble and all. But we noted that even if you take a cash register system, the cost of the thing was mostly the semiconductors in it. So we decided that we'd branch out from the semiconductor business at National. And we started the data checker division, which was grocery store checkout systems, which Fred Bialek ran. And then we saw that in building memory circuits, add-on memory was, when you look at today's numbers, it's amazing. I remember when add-on memory, adding onto an IBM computer, when we broke through that magical barrier of $1 million a megabyte. That was like 1979. I mean, think about it, $1 million for a megabyte in today's world. But that was a big milestone. And so we started to build memory systems and market them through ITEL and other companies as a division within Semiconductor, within the Semiconductor division. So I ran that, and we got to know some big customers, but we were selling through ITEL. They were our principal outlet. Well, then we got word that they were developing a full mainframe competitive with IBM's middle range of computing in San Diego in a secret project. And we found that interesting, and we supplied them some circuits for it, but most of the circuits were coming from Motorola because they were ECL circuits because they were fast. They said, you know, we don't know anything about a technical development like this. We're a leasing company. Would you guys like to get involved in this? So we said, okay, we'll take it over. And they basically gave it to us at that time. But they drove a bargain that they would be the marketing outlet for these things. And at that time, we figured that we could build a 370-158 mainframe computer, sopping wet if we did everything wrong, for $150,000. The market price was $2.1 million from IBM. So we knew the margins were going to be great. And we figured that maybe IBM can do it for $100,000, $95,000, something like that. That's what we figured, because they were much better than us in some of their circuitry. But even at 150, I mean, with the market price at 2.1 million, there's a lot of margin here, okay? So the first year we announced that, which was I think 1979, in the first year we sold $103 million worth of those computers and put $40 million on the bottom line. I mean, it was enormously successful. No, it had to be 78, I guess, because in 79, IBM introduces the 4300 series. And they took the pricing way down to try to, and of course Amdahl was starting to hurt them also, because Amdahl had already been doing that, but Amdahl was focusing at the high end. We were focusing in the mid-range. And one day, ITEL came to us and said, do you want to buy our business? And because we're in trouble, we're close to bankruptcy, this isn't working, the model has changed. So I went up there, talked to them, and with Dave Martin, because he was running the computer products division within the semiconductor division, reporting to me at that time. And so we went up there, it sounded interesting, and so I went to Charlie and said, Charlie, oh, and the big problem was they owed us $80 million, a receivable, and that was going to be really painful. I mean, National wasn't going to be able to handle that easily at that time. That was huge. And so I went to Charlie, and Charlie said, okay, you can buy it as long as it doesn't cost you any money. So we had to talk ITEL into giving us the business and then leasing us the spares inventory, which was how the deal essentially went down. There were some other wrinkles about it. So we took it over on October 1st, 1979 from ITEL, and so we became the end, and so all the ITEL employees came to work for us, and we established a headquarters up here on just off Page Mill Road, in one of the field service offices. And this office, I mean, it was so ITEL and so non-national, it was unbelievable. I mean, it had carpets, and there was all the fancy wall hangings and all. And I mean, it was driving Charlie crazy. But anyway,
National's offices are very spare.
Very Spartan, very Spartan, open offices and those kinds of things. So it was a very different environment. But we took it over, and the deal was that we could give it back to them on January 1st if we felt in those 3 months that this wasn't going to work. And we basically removed the entire top line of management. Got the second line guys there because the top line guys had contracts that were not workable. I mean, if we had to pay them all that, so we had to give them back to ITEL. And we put it together and created a thing called National Advanced Systems. And Charlie asked me to go over and run it. So that's when I left Semiconductor. And then, so for 3 years, I was in the mainframe computer business. And I mean, it's a very dull business, by the way, because every computer room, it didn't matter what industry, it was really largely the same. And we were competing. We had to get Hitachi to agree, because they were the other major product line from ITEL, and it fell my duty to go to Japan and talk Hitachi into it. Now remember, these were the days when the semiconductor industry was just wailing on the Japanese. And Charlie had been quoted saying lots of unnice things. I had been quoted as saying some unnice things about the Japanese. And now I had to go convince them to use us as their sales agent. I mean, this was a sales job. The first week I went over there, I sat in the hotel room all week and had to go home. They wouldn't even meet with me. And then there was a guy at ITEL who did a formal introduction in a Japanese way. And I went back over there and they agreed. And they said, okay, what are you going to do for us? Because they had the same problem. They had a receivables problem. And so we worked out a way to work the receivables, how they got paid, how we got paid for our services. And I committed to them. And where I got this number, I do not even remember. I said, and we will sell 30 of your large machines in the first year. And they were about $4 million machines at that time. So that was a big number. And we sold 31, by the way. And they thought we were geniuses.
How did you know that was the right number to get
I
to?
didn't know. I pulled that baby right out of the air. Now, some of the sales guys were saying, we've got enough deals going. And the key was getting EDS. And so I flew down and I got very involved. We had a guy calling on EDS, but he was calling on the lower levels because he had been an EDS employee, and so he wasn't allowed to formally call on them. And a guy, Mort Meyerson, was running EDS for Ross Perot at that time. And Mort said, well, I want to go to Japan and meet with the guys. Well, it turned out Mort's son was studying Japanese, and he was really into things Japanese, which turned out to be wonderful for us. And so I closed the first order over the phone with Mort after he'd been there for 2 systems. And that was really key, because we could then say the largest computing bureau company in the world was using our systems and had thrown IBM out for their next group of computers. And I told Mort I had a new idea on something that I'd been playing with in National, but I wanted to come down and see him. I was on my way to New York just after he placed the order, so I went down and talked to him. And I said to him, Mort, we are so thrilled to have you as a customer and all. I just wanted to come by and say thank you, but I want to ask you some questions. Why'd you buy from us? I mean, this is a complex product. What was it in our pitch that made? And he gave me all this stuff. And I was grilling him on the different things. He said, Floyd, what's going on here? Most people disappear when they get the order. I said, well, this is a concept I've come up with called win analysis. I said, I've concluded, and this is based on an experience I'd had at Semiconductor, that people build lost business reports and they're full of nonsense. Because most people don't want to tell you why they really didn't give you the order. People who bought from you, they want to establish a relationship. They want to tell you. And so I said, I've decided that it's more important for me to know why I'm winning than why I'm losing. And we instituted that. But that's the first time I personally did it. Mort was so impressed with this. He says, I got to walk you down the hall. You got to tell this story to Ross. And that's how I met Ross Perot. And so I go down. And he said, Ross only has 5 minutes. I said, well, that's great, because my flight, I should leave within the half hour because I'm going on to New York. I sit down in Ross, and he had rocking chairs in his office. It was very country-like. We spent an hour and a half. He asked me every question on the sun. He asked me how transistors work. And I said, well, I remember what I used in those days. How MOS transistors, because he knew something about bipolar transistors, as I recall. I said, well, did you play with magnets and iron filings as a kid? He says, yeah. I said, that's the concept. Now think about that. You're attracting certain carriers and repelling certain carriers, and that's what's creating a channel. That's what a MOS transistor is. And he loved it, I'll have to admit, I thought of that analogy on the fly, sitting in his office, because I was trying, how do you explain a transistor that's attracting and detracting? And I thought of a magnet. And that's what a gate signal is. It's a magnet. And so that's how I established it. And so he insisted every time I went to Dallas and called on Mort that I come by to see him. And they always joke with me about it, because he called me Flawed. And I said, I'm not sure it's spelled F-L-A-W-E-D, or because that's what it sounds like.
Because he has this thick Texas accent.
Very, very thick Texas accent. But I'll just say now, that relationship was very good. And that's how I ended up introducing Ross to Steve Jobs when Next was formed, because of that relationship. Ross called me when Steve was trying to get money for Next, and that's how Perot ended up being a part of that deal. So it's interesting how relationships go along in time. But anyway, so did that for a number of years, and
it sounds like you developed great relationships and had great stories, but you started out by saying
boring business.
Right.
But I got to know the mainframe computer business. I got to know the IT community, really.
And it was so hot right there.
Yeah,
right?
and stuff was changing very, very rapidly. So I get a call one day from Mike Markkula, who's CEO of Apple. Well, I had hired Mike into the Valley in 1966. He worked for me in product marketing. The guy who was running sales, Gene Carter, had worked for me in product marketing. The guy running distribution had run distribution at National in Semiconductors, Roy Weaver. And they said that we're looking for an executive vice president, marketing and sales, distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, half the team has already worked for you, and they want to work for you again. They want you to take the job. So I went over there, and I was attractive for them not because of my semiconductor background, really. It was really the fact that I'd been in the computer business and I knew all the IT guys. Because I'd gotten to know a group called the Research Board, which was run by a lady named Naomi Seligman and Ernie von Simpson at that time, and I'd introduced them to Silicon Valley. So I did that, and I met Steve, and I went from being the young guy to being the old guy over a weekend, because I was always the young guy at National. And yeah, I was in my early 40s by now, but nobody at Apple was 40. Gene Carter is a little older than me, but most of the guys, and Steve was of course famous for saying anybody over 30 doesn't understand computing at that time. But we hit it off, and he, he was the development manager for the Mac at that time, and we hit it off. And
what was it they felt they needed from you? Why you had these relationships and people knew you, but what was it that someone said and it led to the conclusion that Floyd Kvamme was exactly the right guy for them?
Well, I think that was more or less, Mike wanted to know who he was putting in this marketing and sales role, and they wanted to get it a little more organized. And I was thought to have some skills in that particular area of organizing it. It was very clear that I didn't have what they thought was maybe going to be the most important thing, and that was consumer product experience.
I was about to ask you about that.
And so jumping ahead in the story, the first Christmas, I didn't know how to plan for Christmas, but I knew there was a guy on the Apple board named Phil Schlein, who was the head of Macy's West. So I called Phil. I said, Phil, I don't know how to do Christmas. How do I figure out what the demand for Christmas is going to be? And he said, look at your October revenues and look at the rate at which October is changing. Now that was going to be very late, because Christmas is, but our turnaround time through Singapore at that time was pretty fast, and we had that Fremont plant at Apple. And so I took Phil's advice, and we hit it almost dead nuts on. I mean, the guy was so good at consumer, market calculations that he was incredible. But I also didn't know advertising, and I remember, but advertising in a sense is really common sense. I'll never forget this. I'm driving home one night from the office, and I hear one of our ads on about getting your kid a computer for Christmas, because they had to learn this, and you had to expose them to this and this kind of stuff, et cetera, et cetera. I listen to the ad, and I get home, and I called Jane Richardson, our advertising manager. I said, Jane, that ad is upside down. It's all wrong. People are scared stiff of computing. They don't know how they're going to teach their kids, but their kids know how. Turn the ad around. So advertise that your kids are going to teach you computing because they know how it works. Because that was largely becoming true. And we did it, and it was enormously successful. I mean, it was just, so that was just common sense. If you really listened to what you were doing and thought it through as a buyer, you knew that kids in schools were starting to tinker with these things, because the Apple phenomenon was starting to catch on. And the Apple II was selling, and there were these computer clubs all around, and kids were going out and seeing these things. And so we took the burden off the parent buyer for training their kid, and just give them the computer and let them go at it.
You turned it into something exciting.
Yeah, and that they could, that wasn't a, something that they knew they couldn't do, because they couldn't do it.
Let me back up for just one second before we get into the nitty-gritty of Apple. Were your longtime colleagues at National, were they shocked when you said, I'm going to leave this and I'm going to Apple? Was this a real surprise to them at that point?
Well, I only talked to Charlie, and of course, a number of the guys, virtually all, I was kind of almost the last guy to leave of the original group. So, you see, by that time, I was totally uninvolved in Semiconductor. And the thing I loved about Semiconductor was the variety. I mean, you're talking about spacecraft in the morning, watches for lunch, some industrial application that evening. I mean, we were going into everything. Mainframe computers weren't. And we had, it was exciting. We had great market shares. And for example, in Australia, we were ahead of IBM in certain categories, and also it was worldwide. I remember that story about Ross Perot getting these guys out of Iran in the late 70s. Those were our computers, that were being operated there, and so it had its international flavor, and because see, Hitachi then let us do all sell their computers every part of the world except Japan. So we developed their markets all over the place, and so by that time I was reporting to Charlie, and Dave was a natural replacement for me, and so I just said, hey, Charlie, I don't think I want to do this the rest of my life, and it wasn't exciting. I mean, great people, but it was kind of a. And it was a financial business largely, also leasing and that kind of stuff. And I mean, it was interesting. I learned a lot, but it wasn't something I wanted to do.
Let me ask you one final question. We'll take a little break, and then we'll come back to Apple.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about what it was like to work with Charlie.
Charlie was a tough manager, but because he really wanted performance. He was really into meritocracy. If you performed, you were just fine with Charlie. Every day he would go in and look at the computer tabs, and on occasion he would come away and saying, this thing is eating like an elephant and shitting like a bird, because he'd see the new orders and he'd see the output, and that's how he knew which sections were working and which sections weren't working. So he stayed very close to it, but now by that time he had the computer, he had the consumer products division, he had data checker, as well as Semiconductor, which had the computer products division. So there were a lot of things, but he was tough, but he was also incredibly fair. If we had a real reliability problem, he didn't argue about taking the parts back. I remember a major deal with, I think it was Raytheon. I don't remember. I'm almost certain it was Raytheon, where we were wrong, and he agreed to a big return. So he was very honest. Charlie's a very honest guy, and wanted the company to be honest. He wanted us to be fair and that kind of stuff. He always thought that he could out-manufacture anybody, and so the key was getting the right products, and that's what he looked to me to do. And frankly, I think they got too. I always loved Skunk Works. I loved to have the engineers feel that they could invent something new. That kind of disappeared after I left, because they got very regimented in how they new product development forms and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think it worked real well. But marketing is. I think Jerry Sanders had a right concept of marketing. I really adopted this. Jerry looked at our customers as distributors of our technology, not as end users. Because he realized that nobody eats semiconductors. I mean, they have to be put in something that's useful. And that was a relationship, for example, that I had with Jack Tramiel. I mean, Jack owed us enormous amounts of money. And if you recall, in the early days of Commodore, Jack was being sued by everybody for non-payment of receivables, all that kind of stuff. And I remember having a dinner when he was interested in buying our kit of parts. And we went to the dinner with, what was that restaurant that became a Hilton Inn there in the corner of First and near 101. It's now, I don't even know what it is now.
Was it Ricky's? Was it?
It wasn't Ricky's, no. I'm talking way down in San Jose.
Oh, okay.
And we were having dinner down there. And Jack said, okay, well, we agreed on pricing. He agreed on the price and all that kind of stuff. He said, well, shall we have the lawyers make a contract? And I said to Jack, do you need a contract? I don't need a contract. He says, you don't? I said, no. I said, I just have one condition. If I ship you the parts, will you pay me? And he said, yeah. And he reached across the table, and that was our deal with Commodore. Because everybody had a contract, they always figured out a way out of it. It was a useless exercise in contracting. And Jack, I mean, he had that thing down to a science. We'd ship him the parts. 3 days later, he'd have them in a calculator against an LC, and he'd pay us in 30 days. He had his money way before he had to pay us. But then as the pricing started to come down, as $39.95 wasn't holding and it went to $29.95, $19.95, his business was slacking off, and he needed better pricing from us. And so the original contract for a gazillion parts at whatever the price was, it changed with time. Now, we were, of course, making progress on our costs also, and yeah, I shared that with him, but he was successful and I was successful.
And it worked.
And it worked. He was a distributor of my technology. And so, you know, a lot of people had a lot of ugly Jack Tramiel stories. I had a wonderful relationship with Jack. I mean, there wasn't many guys who showed you their Auschwitz number on his arm, you know. I mean, he had an interesting background. Or no, it was a Polish camp that he was in, but he had the number emblazoned in his arm, you know, because he had gone through that. So he was a realist. And as a matter of fact, I still see his sons on occasion. I haven't seen Jack for a good long while. I say a good long while, maybe 2-3 years. But we had a good relationship.
You sort of gave the intro to Apple and how you joined it, but let's start there with this part of the oral history. So what part of 1982? Was that? It was 1982.
Yes, yeah, the end of the year.
Okay, at the end of the year. And what was happening at Apple at that point?
Well, they were getting ready for some key introductions. You know, I mean, they were not ready. They were selling Apple II like crazy, and that was the product really at that time. But the Lisa was in development, the Mac was in development, and they were supposed to be introduced in June of '83, both of them, the Mac IIe, which was an upgrade to the Mac II. Excuse me, the Apple IIe was also you know, in its final stages of development, and that was supposed to be introduced in the spring before the Lisa and the Mac. So there was a lot of development activity. The company was divided into, I think, 7 or 8 different divisions: Mac, Lisa, 2/3. The 3 wasn't selling well, and so that was also an issue. And then a peripherals division. What were some of the other ones? I don't even remember, but there were a number of...
there was software? Were you doing any software at that
Actually,
point?
there wasn't a software division at that time. That happened later.
Yeah. And when you came into the company, were you told at that point there was this product roadmap and these new things called Lisa and Macintosh?
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually, I was shown those before I actually agreed to join. And that some of these would have application in, you know, large corporate situations. They were also thinking about large, the college level. The Apple IIe was being distributed into K-12, mostly high schools. The Kids Can't Wait program had already been introduced, where we gave a computer to every high school in California, and so there was a follow-up of that. So the education piece was also there at that time.
And what did you think when you? Because here it is, it's 1982. The IBM PC has been introduced at that point, right? It was, of course, the Apple II had been out for a long time, had been successful. What was your thought about this new industry called personal computing, and the opportunities it presented?
It was very clear to me that this was going to be a big deal, mostly because I had guys at National who were carrying computers in their in the back door, doing analysis on it, keeping track of customers, like the guy, even before I left Semiconductor, the guy who ran distribution, a guy named Ed Ducey, had a computer program to keep track of all the distributors, and so he had his own little database. He didn't have to wait, because in those days, if you wanted a new report from IT, it took forever. You had to meet with the guys, and invariably, because it wasn't their report, it wasn't structured exactly the way you would want it, and so you got it right about the third time about how the report ought to look, and then you'd wait for the tabs to come down, the big sheets of paper, and so there were a lot of people using PCs or Apple IIe's for applications that in most cases they'd purchased themselves personally. So there was no great secret that these things were valuable. How valuable was always a question about, how wide would this get?
And then of course as you mentioned, you'd already been selling a lot of product to Jack Tramiel, and Commodore was very successful with its PC. And did that also help you see the gaming side of it? I mean, did you really see at that point that there was there were personal uses for the PC?
Yeah, because a lot of companies, or a lot of individual people also were starting to keep track of their own stuff that way. Doctors, dentists, lawyers, a lot of people were doing it, and kind of that leading edge that of folks, that the early adopter phase, you might call it, from using marketing lingo, was clearly there, even in that early day. And people were figuring out how to do new things with these things, but again, it was all backdoor kinds of things. Now, IT departments were not particularly interested in personal computers. By that time, the hierarchy of 3270 terminals were on everybody's desk, and they all hierarchically headed up into the central mainframe thing. And so one of my first things that I was asked to do was to introduce us to the guys I already knew in that field. And for example, now it's a year later, but I remember the intro of the Mac to that crowd. One of that crowd's biggest problems was training. And the mouse had really changed all that. The necessity for being a computer programmer to use a computer was slipping away. As a matter of fact, I used to use the illustration that I remembered as a boy, that when we bought the 1949 Pontiac that was automatic, now Mom could drive. You didn't have to know how to shift gears. You didn't have to know all this stuff. You just put it in drive and you drove. And that was the analogy I used for mouse-based computing. You didn't have to know all those C/, all that kind of stuff. It was all hidden from you. You just pointed at something that you wanted to open, and you clicked, and it opened. And so when we introduced the Mac, I'm getting a little ahead of the story, but when we introduced the Mac, for example, to these IT executives, we actually took them, we arranged to get about 30 of them from the research board crowd, and these were large corporate users, and we just ran a training session. Steve sat on the desk in front of the room in his lotus position with his legs crossed and talked to this group. It was the funniest thing, because they weren't exactly used to that. And he came in, jumped up on the desk, crossed his legs, and sat there and talked. And we ran them through a training session and just had them do this. And because that was a huge problem that they always had, getting enough programmers to do everybody's program. And everybody was always angry about the fact that programming took too long. So there was this natural thing going on that you knew that the times they were changing.
When did you know Steve Jobs before you went to Apple?
I met him when they were interviewing me.
Okay.
And we talked about what my job would be, and I told him what my background was, and frankly I was very honest with him about what I didn't know anything about, because I didn't know squat about consumer marketing. But I said, I think I can learn this, and products. Our product. And the nice thing was, part of the reason I think we kind of hit it off was, I really was a product guy. I wasn't a another story. When we introduced the Lisa, I arranged to have, because we had to have something that looked large, corporate user kind of thing, because Lisa was not a consumer product at all. It was the upper end of what was going to be the Mac Lisa line. So we arranged with American President Lines up here to have an intro with John Cullinane. If you remember, Cullinet Software was one of the big database management systems, and they wanted to have a tie with Apple. They thought that would be good for them, so I arranged that. And so we went up to shoot some footage up there at American President Lines on their raised floor with their IBM computers. And we step on the floor, and Steve says to me, "This is the first time I've ever been in a computer room." And that's what he said. And so I said, "Well, you know what these are? This is a 370, 165, I think, was sitting there." And I said, "Here's the console, and this is and all the stuff is underneath this raised floor." I said, "But you want to see something interesting?" And I opened the skins. And if you remember, the inside of those computers in those days looked like a rat's nest. There were wires all over the place, and it was point-to-point largely for capacitive coupling reasons, and there were some technical reasons for that. But the cameras are rolling, and what you hear Steve say is, "What is all that shit?" and I said, "Well, that's how these things are put together." And it had an incredible impact on him. I mean, it was really something. He decided that IBM doesn't care about products. They're only a marketing company. They're not a products company. And I could beat these guys because they don't care about what a product really looks like. It's all veneer. It was really interesting. I mean, now again, he must have been thinking that before. He must have torn into a PC sometime or another because the PC was out by that time. But I'll never forget that because he just stood there almost in amazement how this company could market this thing for these kinds of margins and it looked like that. And like I said, there was some defense for how it looked, but boy, not in his mind. I mean, it was just a big batch of wires that nobody could ever really fix, and it was a mess, he thought.
Well, that says a lot about why the inside of an Apple II is as simple and elegant, and how that continued right on through the Macintosh and the other products, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you take Mac, when we introduced the Mac, this is a story I've told a number of times, maybe I've told it to you, but I get a call from Roy Weaver, who's running distribution at that time, about 3 weeks, I think, before intro. And Roy tells me, Steve was just here, and I could just tell by his voice that this was not good news. And I said, so what happened, Roy? He said he rejected all the packing boxes. I said, why did he do that? They're not the right white. If you remember, they came in a white box, and the white wasn't right. So we had to redo all of them. And now, Roy, I'm sure, was trying to get me to overrule, because I could have. But I said, we got to make them the right white. Now, what that was showing was Steve understood that on a store floor, our product was sitting there in a beautiful, white, well-done box next to a brown corrugated piece of cardboard. I mean, think of the difference. And that's what he cared about. He wanted that product to be right, not from only the inside. The packing carton had to be the right white. But that's Steve Jobs. Mm-hmm. You buy an iPhone today, I mean, what do you see? You see exquisite packaging. And he knows that that has value. And many people didn't understand that that had value. They wanted to dig in to get the top thing that you ran when you opened the Mac box was how to handle this package, how to unpack it. Nobody did that in those days. But he showed, take this first. You got to read this first, then take this, and then do this, and then plug this in here, and made it simple. And the training manual was that thick. And if you remember the first ads, we showed that book dropping on a page, and then we dropped the MS-DOS manuals, and they were this large a stack of manuals. It brought computing to the rest of us, as he said.
So let's. I'm going to just get a little organized now about your experience at Apple. So you join in late '82, and things are happening, bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
Right? There's
Yeah.
You've got these Apple II and Apple IIe lines. You've got the upcoming introduction of the Lisa and the Mac and in '83. So talk a little bit about that kind of just incredibly rapid 12 months of things just happening.
Well, we were also, the company was growing very, very rapidly. It was heading for $1 billion that year, and or it just finished $1 billion, I guess, and was heading north of that. And there was just a lot to do, staffing up, getting more stores involved. The store situation was also sort of changing. It had, of course, been almost all single stores, but then the computer lands of the world, business land was starting. That's how I met Kevin Compton, actually, who I later attracted to KP. And so the nature of the distribution thing was also changing, because it was very clear that this thing was going to break out of its mold, and there was going to be a demand for a conglomeration of these stores. So dealing with them, dealing with the pricing was critical. Obviously margins were very, very important, but also international rollout. Getting the stuff in all these languages was a big. So there was a lot to do, and the advertising budget was growing. I mean, as I recall, the marketing budget the last year I was there, it was something north of $300 million. I mean, it was a lot. There was a lot of money involved, and then by the summer of '83. We're talking about the Mac intro. We now know it's not going to happen in June. When the Lisa intro has happened, and it was an exciting intro, but the product didn't have a lot of software, it didn't have a lot of what it needed. And so we talked about, how do we advertise? We had a great advertising agent, Chiat Day. Jay Chiat was very involved. Now again, there's another guy. He had been at National's advertising agency, so I knew him also. So a lot of the cast of characters were people I knew.
Did you bring in Chiat Day?
No, Regis had. Oh, and Regis was there. And Regis, of course, had worked with us at National. He was an employee at National in the early days. And
Regis McKenna.
McKenna, yeah. So again, there was a lot of old home week kind of of the characters over there. John Vinard was there and running a certain section and all, and of course he had been at National and all. But anyway, in putting together the thing, Steve, again, being into excellence kind of thing, had somehow met Ridley Scott. I don't know how, but Blade the Runner, the movie, had been heralded, and he had talked to Ridley Scott about shooting our commercials for advertising the Mac and the Lisa. And I remember the meeting in like June, and this is before Scully was there, before I'd hired Bill Campbell, but maybe Scully was just about ready to show up, and the Lisa ad was going to run in the fall, pointing out what the technology was, and then the Mac ad was going to run across all the bowl games on January 1st. And you could buy time such that it ran almost the same time. And so
this was the famous 1984.
1984 ad, yeah. But at that meeting, we talked about it being based on 1984 now the intro had slipped to 1984. And I remember the big concern was, obviously, everybody was going to focus on 1984 in their advertising. So we had to hit January 1st, because that was going to be a very popular theme, and it was going to be, so we had to do it right. We had to be early with, or else it was going to be a really worn out theme. So we get the two ads. I forget exactly what they cost, but there was like $700,000–800,000 to get them done by Ridley Scott in London. The Alone Again ad runs, it's black and white also, advertising Lisa, and it didn't do well. It just didn't do well, and so.
When you say it didn't do well,
the Lisa sales, no, Lisa sales didn't happen, and the business was flaky. If you remember, end of '83, there was a recession kind of coming on. Apple II sales were looking a little weak also, and we were in Struggleville, for a while there. So we didn't run the ad that much, and Lisa sales were flagging. There was no question about it. And so, but in the October sales meeting in Hawaii, we showed the guys the 1984 ad. They went nuts, the sales force. They went nuts. They were up on the tables, jumping up and down, and it was just sensational, And so Then in December, there's a board meeting. Now, I did not attend board meetings. I was not on the board. I was not invited to board meetings. But by that time, John Scully's in the company. And he had arranged to have some lifestyle ads for the Apple II run, which had people, you know, sitting at a desk and then going out and shooting some baskets, full color and that kind of stuff. Well, the board decided that we couldn't afford to run the 1984 ad. We didn't have the money. And we, I mean, I must admit, it was insubordination on my part. There's no way I was going to not run that ad. I was trying to figure out how to do it. We'd purchased, by this time, we knew the across the board on January 1st was going to be too expensive. So we'd purchased 2 minutes in the Super Bowl, which was later in the month. Now we were really worried, because now we were going to be late with a 1984 message. And what's going to happen? You know, everybody's going to be on 1984. We'll have an old message, but the ad was so well done, and the sales force loved it so much. You know, we got to run it. So time's slipping on, and fortunately, we interpreted the the board's directive that we had to sell it and not lose any money. And a minute was, I still remember the number, $905,000. And so we were getting offers and all, and somebody bought a 30, so we had a minute and 30 left, and time's running out, January's, and we still have this minute 30. Friday afternoon before the Super Bowl, and you had to distribute something out. I don't remember exactly how that all worked. Jane Richardson comes up, Bill Campbell and I sitting out. By this time I've hired Bill Campbell, and he had been at the sales meeting in October. And we're sitting in my office, and Jane said, I've got an offer for the minute for the Super Bowl, $700,000. So we're going to have to write off $205,000. And I don't remember this exactly, and neither Bill and I remember this exactly, but one of us said the other, did she say anything? And we said, we didn't hear you, Jane, go away. So we sent her out of the office, obviously rejecting the thing, and of course the ad run. Now we'd tested the ad that week in Fort Lauderdale, which was the headquarters of IBM PC. Just for joke, just for laughs, okay? And the thing we knew was the 30 didn't work. The 30 didn't tell the story well enough. You know how in advertising they do a long ad and then they do short ones. Today they're doing even 15s against 30s. Right. So doing a 30 follow up to a minute, because you kind of remembered the rest if you'd seen the minute long enough. But alone, the 30 didn't. And I frankly don't remember what finally happened in the last 30. I don't even remember what we did with that. We could have written it off. I don't know what happened. But the minute runs. The reaction is incredible. We get phone calls the next week of people who want us to run it again. We said, you can run it again if you want to, but we ain't paying you. And so TV stations around the country ran that ad a number of times in the next week or two, not on our nickel. And by that time, the Mac had been introduced, because it was introduced the Tuesday after Super Bowl. I think Super Bowl was January 21st, and the ad was pointing to a 23rd. And the area where we got super lucky, to my knowledge, to this day, nobody ran a 1984 themed ad but us. Nobody. And that's hard to believe, really, when you think about what that was. But I think the negative connotation of 1984, I think a lot of ad agencies stayed away from it as a concept for an ad. But that was enormously lucky. We didn't know that. And imagine what that would have been like had you seen a dozen different 1984 ads, you know, before that. It wouldn't. I don't think it would have had the impact, even though it was a phenomenal ad.
Well, and of course, what you had managed to do was take the negativity of 1984
and turn it
on its head.
That's exactly right. And that's what that ad had done. And I also, what I'd done when I got the storyboards before it was actually being done by Ridley Scott, because I think he did it in like September. We decided on it in like June. I'm not sure of these dates, but it was around that time frame. I'd gotten the storyboards. I brought them home one night, and I had a good friend who was a movie director at that time, and he lived up in towards Santa Cruz. I drove him up to his place and said, is this a good story? Because I knew nothing about advertising. And he said, that's a sensational story. And he pleaded with me to have him do the ad. I said, no. And I couldn't tell him that Ridley Scott was doing it, because that was secret. I said, that contract's already let. I'm really, really sorry. But you know, he's a personal friend. He's a personal friend to this day. But he saw those storyboards, and so that helped me realize that this was going to be special. So.
Were you and Steve, I mean, as we now know, looking back on it, marketing and this end-to-end product sensibility that he had really was one of the things that made him unique. And here you were, Executive VP of Marketing. Were you working together closely? I mean, was he really someone you were always talking to, or he was always talking to you? How did that work?
No, I wouldn't say that. You know, we saw each other regularly, particularly at the product meetings and when we were doing planning, because basically how it worked was the manufacturing operation sold product to me. I was responsible for distribution, taking them out of the manufacturing site through the distribution channel and getting the most I could for them from a sales standpoint, and for the outside advertising and all that kind of stuff. But Steve was so focused on product that he spent most of his time, most of his waking hours, worrying about that thing coming out right, you know, and being the right product. Now, we had some conversations about that, because one of the things that Steve did that was totally unique in that day, and I always marveled at it. You know, Apple was an assembler of other people's technology, when you think about it. As a matter of fact, most systems companies were assemblers of semiconductor, memory, display, you know, keyboard to an extent, all of that, when you're speaking hardware. Obviously, software was a different story. What he did was he stayed in incredibly close touch with hardware vendors. So he knew it was coming, and he was willing to take the risk of being sole sourced, so he could be first with new technology. Now, if you compare that in those days with HP, who insisted on everything they used being second sourced, they were always late in being, they were never an early adopter of technology as a result. It was a very conservative approach, but it differentiated the companies. Now, you also knew, because we sold products to Apple from my national days, and I stayed in touch with their design ins and nationals. National screwed up on an occasion or two in selling to Apple. Man, they went in the penalty box. And it wasn't 2 minutes, it wasn't 5 minutes, it was a major. They got blocked out of the game for a few cycles, okay? So, I mean, he really understood his vendors. He was willing to take that risk, but boy, you had to perform. And it wasn't pretty if you didn't perform. But by the way, he had very few alternatives if you didn't perform, and he knew that also. That's largely what happened with that Twiggy drive, and that's why the hard shell media, you know, was such a savior for that, but it was going to take a while, and he made the deal with Sony to get that going. And if you recall, that set the standard for 3.5 inch, because there were 3 inch, 3.5 inch, 4 inch hard shells, and the fact that the Mac went with that 3.5 inch set that standard.
It made the industry.
It made that industry and made that form factor happen.
So the Macintosh gets in.
But now, having said that,
okay.
I mean, I remember being up at Steve's house when he lived in Los Gatos one day, and we were going over some stuff, and he then said, "By the way, Floyd, I'm dating a new girl tonight, and I want to play her and sing this song to her." And he goes to the piano, and he was a very accomplished pianist, by the way. And he sings this song to me. He says, "What do you think she'll think of it?" I said, "Steve, I really don't know." But he would do those kinds of things. He would show, talk to me about that, I mean, I always thought that was kind of special. Again, I didn't go camping with him. I didn't have many dinners. I had dinner with him, I think, once or twice in the house out in Woodside. I mean, in '83, many people think the iPhone idea was a revelation that came, in the late '90s. He took me to a skunk works in Los Gatos, where they had the skunk works for a phone that, what was it called? Frog Design was working on. Now, they were working on other products for him, but he was into the phone thing, but he didn't like what it would look like, so he wasn't going to introduce a kludgy thing. Matter of fact, my first mobile-to-mobile phone call that I ever had with anybody was with Steve Jobs. he called me, and I'll never forget his reaction. He says, "Are you driving?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "I'm driving too." He says, "This is really groovy." You know, and it was like 1983 or something like that. But he had that in his mind because he saw communications as being a really key thing, but he wanted it to be special. And it took, what, 14 years for that idea to gel into something that could be done? But you can't say that Steve wasn't thinking phones, because I saw it in like 83, maybe it was early 84, because I left the company in you know, just mid 84. So, you know, that's what he's like.
So let's cover that period from the introduction of the Mac until you left Apple. The introduction happens after the commercial. What kind of success does it see at that point?
It was a little slow, but what we did was we introduced a college program, and a guy named Daniel Lewin was responsible for that. He works for Microsoft now. But Daniel and I introduced the college program, and the deal was that we'd sell the colleges at special price, $1,000. And we closed a deal with Drexel University. That was the first one for, I forget how many. It was in the 1,000 or so machines, and then another big university deal. And then we got a big deal based on that introduction with the research board from DuPont. I think that was 6,000 machines. I'm not sure. It was a big deal. But you know, there wasn't a lot of software, so the early sales were a little slow during that early period. And then I left shortly after that, after Intro. So not shortly, but a while after Intro, and he, you know, so like anything else, it took off a little slowly, but then it just suddenly just upticked. It got to a, you know, some magic point, and suddenly everybody, it became what Apple already was, the thing to have. And I think, frankly, the '84 ad helped that, and you know, the whole, you know, people were real excited about those products.
So what took you from Apple to Kleiner and to venture capital? How did that happen?
Well, you know, I guess one way to answer the question is they made me a deal I couldn't refuse. But I don't talk about this a lot, but John Sculley was not my favorite guy. I wasn't very impressed with him. I think he almost killed the company, ultimately. He was not a product guy. He was a marketing guy. And we were a products company. And it was, I mean, think about it. When I was there, if you wanted to walk into a store and buy an Apple computer, we had a solution for you. You know, as I recall, $9.95, $12.95, $14.95, $17.95, $21.95, $24.95, $29.95. We had a solution all the way up to 10 grand for the Lisa by the time that all happened. There's no question that the higher end of that range was the most profitable, because the amount of real cost for those increments of a few $100s was de minimis. But you got people in. By the time John was there a couple of years, the first offering was $29.95. And yeah, they were looking more profitable, but I don't think it was any way to run a railroad. Nobody was developing software for them. And because there was no volume. There was a few high-end users who were nuts about it. And you know, I'm somewhat reticent because I don't like to criticize people, but John was the wrong guy for Apple. And he proved it when he let go of Steve.
As you look back on it now, sort of seeing Apple before and then inside and then afterwards, what's the explanation for that moment in Apple's history, John coming in and doing
exactly as has been reported. I mean, Steve was of the opinion, and there was nobody to, I mean, I think everybody in the company was kind of on the same page that this was going to be a consumer products play. Now, it didn't turn into a consumer products play for a long time. We had to figure out how to get, and we therefore aimed, while I was there, at marketing departments in large corporations, because there was things that you could do. I mean, just Steve's whole, you know, thing about fonts. He was so right, you know. It was incredible, you know. Things printed off computers until Macintosh, or until Lisa and Macintosh, were dull. They were all, you know, single font. you know, a few dots.
Was the IBM Selectric typeface just
That was it.
transferred to
Yeah,
it?
you know, and so marketing departments loved the Mac. They could do things that looked like they'd done something original. And they choose a font, and there weren't a lot of fonts in the early days, but that lady that did all the font development also, she was, I don't remember her name, she was terrific. And so it was, you know, it was possible to sell through those things, and the consumer thing, of course, happened in time. But it wasn't all about just the marketing. You know, it wasn't all about the pizzazz. It was, you know, the product had to have value, and Steve understood that and liked that about it. I mean, and Steve just really rebelled. Let me tell you a story that I don't think I've ever told anybody in any setting like this. I've never done it in a conference. Just before the Mac was introduced, I believe it was just before, but a very short time before. It may have been in January. It may have been just after it was introduced. I'm not really sure, but it was a very tight time. We got a call from AT&T, and they wanted to make a deal. And sales were crappy, you know, at that time. So, you know, we said, hey, let's listen. You know, what are they talking about? And they wanted to come out and they wanted to make a deal. And it was, I don't remember whether it was going to be a private label deal or just, you know, tying together the two companies and this kind of stuff. They sent out an entourage for a secret meeting about some sort of arrangement with Apple. And so we sat the key guy, who was the product planning guy for AT&T's computers, down at a Mac. I mean, it's funny if it wasn't so tragic. Here's the guy who's doing the product planning for personal computers for AT&T. Steve sits him down and says, by the way, what kind of a computer do you use? I don't use a computer. Well, Steve shows him how to, and then Steve basically turned it over to somebody else, as I recall, even how to run the thing. Here was a company that had marketing guys that had no knowledge of the product at all from a personal experience doing the product planning. Steve's interest in doing that deal with AT&T was zero because of that. I mean, he loved the products. And we were all product people. I mean, take Mike Markkula. Mike Markkula is a products guy. He loved the products. And I mean, you know, in the early days of Apple, some of the software was written by Johnny Appleseed. You remember that? That's Mike Markkula. That was his pseudonym you know, because he didn't want to put his name on it. But so the fact that we were product, Steve was a product guy, and all of us were product guys. We really did maybe believe that if you built a better product, the world would be a path to your door. But my role, therefore, was, you know, trying to find places to sell all these things, giving the you see some of the advertising and some of the marketing materials were really what we used to call, you know, push-pull. Namely, we'd push them to the dealer, and then we had to pull people in to the dealer, because the dealers didn't do a lot of going out and selling. They had to bring people to their store. And so just developing all that was, you know, keeping us busy and trying to keep the stores busy and getting them the volume. I don't know if that answers your question. That's what we did.
Well, and it sounds like there were increasingly differences of opinion between product people like you and John's orientation as a CEO and what he wanted to do. Yeah, well, because he was very much a marketing kind of guy. I mean, if you look at the ad that he did for the Apple II for that Christmas, those lifestyle ads, I mean, they are very non-memorable in my mind, because they weren't really, they were saying you have to have one of these to be a hip person. And I for sure am not a hip person. And I mean, I wanted to see value for this thing, and going out and shooting basketball hoops with my computer screen running there, I never got the connection, frankly. I mean, it was, you know, a lot of people are into lifestyle things, or they buy, you know, certain brands because of that kind of stuff. That's just not who I am. Now, Steve drove Porsches because he felt they were fine products, not because they were Porsches. They were fine products. You know, he liked, you know, there was some music thing he liked because they were finely designed
things. And so he was a products guy.
Yeah, yeah. So through a combination of kind of your not being completely happy with that situation and then being approached, I take it, from Kleiner, you decide to make the change to venture capital.
Yeah.
So how did that work?
Well, KP had just raised the first mega fund, first greater than $100 million fund, and they had committed to adding general partners to do that. And this was KPCB 3. And so John Doerr called me. He had learned of me, and he knew that I had semiconductor background, mainframe computer background, and now personal computer background, which was a nice triangle. As a matter of fact, he told me one time he didn't know of anybody else on the planet who had all three at that time, and I wouldn't doubt that's probably true, and at an executive level. So he asked me to come over. I was not an active investor. I've never played the stock market. I'd never done much of that kind of stuff. I'd always been heads down in the job of mostly product-oriented kinds of things, and how do you sell it? How do you market it? What's the messaging and that kind of stuff? But the variety opportunity with what was happening in personal computers was terrific. And the first thing so I joined them, and they made me a fabulous deal.
And let's talk for a moment about just the nature of venture capital itself in the early 1980s. So it had been launched. It had been launched here in the Valley, and was it doing well? I mean, now looking on 25 years later,
I would say it was doing well. I mean, KP was doing well because KP in their first fund in '72 had launched Tandem Computers and Genentech. I mean, and the other 6 investments hadn't done that well, but these 2 had done so well, and the formula was so well set that a few good ones really would rescue a fund. And the second fund had a number of real big successes, both on the drug side, Hypertech and those, and on the computing side. They'd done Compaq. They'd done Lotus, which was a software entity, of course, of some fame at that time. And as a matter of fact, as soon as I joined, I was asked to join the Lotus board, to be KP's person on the Lotus board. So and because I had sold in Boston, I knew a lot of people in Boston. And so that was kind of natural. So I was the Boston partner for a little while, actually, also commuting out there to go on Lotus board meetings. And we did a thing called Bachman Systems, which was out there, and the firm had done some other things also in Boston. But as far as analyzing things from an investor's point of view, I was, again, a products kind of guy. And frankly, I made a number of early, just really bad investments. And the one I'm most embarrassed by, because this guy Chaz Hobb I mentioned had gone into the software business with a group of products that were on the Hobb. And I knew Chaz. I knew his ability to sell. I knew his ability to market. And so I was drawn to that, and we invested in it. Fortunately, we didn't invest very much, but the products were lousy. And since I wasn't a software guy, I didn't see through that. And so I went away from my strength of understanding product and talking about product. And software was a big area of investment at that time. And sitting on the Lotus board, I saw the value of software, but I later got involved in a couple of other software investments that turned out pretty well. But that first one was an example of, hey, you gotta stay to your roots. What do I know? And I knew products, and I had to admit I knew mostly hardware products and hardware things, because I also made an investment in that I made alongside Tom Perkins. We both got involved in a semiconductor capital equipment deal, and because I talked to the guys in the industry, and we had a leading guy from the industry, proposing this thing, and it turned out that it was way ahead of its time. So that was also an issue. I knew the application, But those two examples were examples of things that I realized that I had defied Jobs' law. The product has to be insanely great, and you have to know that. And that's hard to do when it's out of your area of expertise. So, and the other thing that was really hard for me in the early days is I'd run development programs. I'd run a lot of development programs. And when you're there every day, you know what's going on in a development program. When you're there even once a week or once a month, it's a lot different. And so you had to really transfer the vision that you saw in a product and make sure that that person, matter of fact, I invented a term for my companies. There had to be one guy in the company, didn't necessarily have to be the CEO, who was the keeper of the vision. Because that's what Steve was, that's what Bob Weidler had been in earlier days. There was always a keeper of the vision. I didn't call it that back then, but that was what I did. So it took me probably a year and a half or so to really understand how the business really worked and how we would make the kinds of returns that we needed to make.
And did you have a specific portfolio going into it that you wanted to try to build? You talked about these three areas that you worked
because you know, in those days we were being approached by entrepreneurs, and we'd all talk about them. And unfortunately, we had a uniform thing. Everybody had to agree on every investment, and then somebody went on the board. That was 80% the case. If it was an East Coast investment, we always had to have a co-investor back east. That was our guy, you might say.
And so you're joining a partnership where there are people who've been there and who are well established.
But it's very small.
Yes.
Kleiner, Perkins. Kleiner was phasing out. Perkins, Caulfield, Byers, John Doerr, Jim Lally, and their secretaries. Period. Oh, and Mike Curry, the finance guy. So there were. I mean, the thing that was surprising to me is there were 10 people in the whole company. It was tiny. Maybe 15 people by the time you counted executive assistants, what we call secretaries in those days. So it was tiny, and when you wanted advice on something, you called in a few experts, let them be VC for a day, and you learn that with time. But then the other thing is, you also learned that the business was not primarily investing; it was working with the entrepreneurs to help them develop the company. And since I'd had a lot of VPs and exec VPs, and I once counted that of the people who worked for me at National and Apple, something like 26 of them became CEOs in the Valley. And so I'd worked with a lot of guys that knew how to run things, but you had to keep that going.
Can you name some names of people who were in that 26?
Well, Mike Markkula would be certainly one. Bob Swanson, Jim Diller in the semiconductor side. There's so many of them that went out. I mean, I'm on the board of Balu Christian's, Power Integrations. He worked mostly in the semiconductor field, most of the guys. And a lot of them with smaller companies, but I'm forgetting a lot of major ones. I know.
I didn't mean to put you on
Jack Gifford.
Oh, sure.
Jack Gifford worked my organization. Obviously, Bill Campbell. Now ran into it later. Ron Conway. I hired Ron Conway into his first job in the Valley. I'd have to look at the list. I don't think about those things that often.
It's a great alumni group.
Yeah, yeah.
So, back to this, what you were talking about. Tom Perkins, I've heard him describe this as the KP way. It's what you said. It wasn't just, we're going to invest in your company. It was, we don't invest unless we think you're a company we can get in there and really help with. And,
that's right.
And turn into a great
company.
Enterprise.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Was that important to you?
That was very important, because that said that the products mattered. It wasn't only about making money. It was also, yes, making money was important because that's what your customer wanted, your investor wanted. But it was about, the thrill of having a variety of things to work with and to develop people. And that was exciting. And I mean, you look at how Tom had developed Jimmy Trybig. That was terrific. And that was very, very important to me. And I really enjoyed it.
And her Boyer.
Yeah, Boyer was another example. Yeah.
So how does one, from a historical perspective, because that's part of what we're interested in, how does one make that transition to become a venture
Well, in those
investor?
days, almost everyone came out of an operating role in industry. There was no school that taught you how to be a venture capitalist. That wasn't an elective in an MBA school. So virtually everybody in the business was an engineer who had been in a product development phase. I mean, at KP, you could argue that only Frank Caulfield had not had a formal, engineering position. I believe he has an engineering degree. I don't remember right now, but he had never actually managed the development of products. Jim, John, Tom, everybody had. So it was a very technical kind of thing, and that was what was important at that time. And you putting a few dollars into this thing, you could also see with a very few dollars. See, the big deal was bringing what the firm and what Tom called bringing the risk up front. The story you'd tell is if you came in and said that you had the cure to cancer, I don't need a sales organization now. I don't need a marketing organization right now. I don't need manufacturing. I need to know whether you have the cure to cancer. So you put all the money on that. So a lot of these companies were really development things, and then if it worked, then you poured money in the second round. And actually, we did a study one time. We actually made more money in second round investments than on first round investments because they were larger and they were backing the ones that the first round had shown that this guy has the cure to cancer or has something that's workable. And so the logic of the business is very straightforward.
And that also minimizes the amount of risk you're putting in up front.
Oh, of course.
Right.
Yeah, because you're doing the right you're doing the right stuff. You don't need a whole team to do that. Now, what happened in the late 90s, of course, was that and virtually all investment was in technological capability. They were tech risk. Can they, in fact, build a chip that's this fast? Can they build a drug that really does this? Can you build a system that does this communications thing, with those parameters that are being promised? In a world where everything was improving by a factor of 2 every couple of years anyway, or 18 months if you used Moore's law or that kind of thing. So the idea was, usually, does this person's suggestion that they can build something today, they can start building something today that's going to be 10 times better when it's introduced 2 years from now? Is that possible? Because those are the kind of numbers, because the world was getting better. So if somebody came with an idea that was twice as good as what was in the market, that wasn't good enough. It had to be way more than that. And so you had to, kind of test the credibility of that.
What was one of the first investments where you felt your background and experience, your knowledge, all came together with your partners to really make something great happen?
Well, the one that I worked on that was handed to me very shortly after the investment was made, and I helped build the team, was Xilinx. Scott Brown, I helped them recruit him because he had worked for me at National as the sales manager, and he did a great job over there. Now, that was John Doerr's original idea to invest in it, but John asked me to sit in on those board meetings before it was public, and I never formally went on the board, and John never formally went on the board, but Bernie was a great guy to work with, and bringing Scotty in there, Scotty actually asked me to be the speaker at their first sales meeting. But that was a fun project because it was moving away. See, people were doing that for just mock-ups, and we had to convince them that this was the right product to stay within the manufacturing stage. And so through that transition, that was kind of a fun marketing and selling kind of exercise while that project was going up. And then obviously sitting on the Lotus board was also very, very informative. Because I replaced Ben Rosen because IBM was starting to use a lot of Lotus products, and Ben was the chairman of Compaq, And they basically came to him and said, Lotus or Compaq? And they expected him to pick Lotus, and he picked Compaq. So he dropped off the board, and we had done that investment jointly with Seven Rosen, KP had. Again, just before my time, but I was asked to go back and sit on that board. And like I said, that was a very good investment. So I immersed myself very early, except for things like the Hava mistake, in some existing companies that they basically handed to me. That first semiconductor capital equipment company also was actually already invested in, and I was asked to join the board with Tom so that I could introduce it to the semiconductor companies and understand that whole thing. There was actually two companies in that. So I phased in by doing work on probably 4 companies that they had already made decisions to invest in, but they hadn't developed yet. And then a couple of my own, the ones that I took over and introduced later on.
And how did you find this? Was this satisfying? Is this a phase of your career?
Because people development I've always loved, and you get to work with exciting people. And I'd worked, let's face it, I mean, when you've worked with Steve, when you've worked with Bob Weidler, when you worked with some of those kinds of characters in your past, that's exciting. Seeing people develop is exciting to me, and I always loved it. I mean, I had this practice way back at National. They'd say, Floyd, you got to help us talk somebody out of leaving our company because they're going over to do something else. And I used to say, well, why should we talk them out of it? I mean, if that's better for them, why should we talk them out? We better find something. If they're that good, that they're being asked to do this out here, we better go out and find something for them to do with us that takes that talent, and puts it to use. I mean, that's the way I feel about folks. That's why, that's why I'm proud of the fact that so many people became CEOs. I mean, I had some small say, in some of this, larger in some cases, smaller in others. But that's fun, developing people.
That's a side of venture capital I expect many people don't get to see. That and maybe it's because not everyone focuses on that, but certainly you did, and have and do.
Yeah. No, I mean, going into a board meeting, this idea was given to me very early on by a guy on a board of a company we'd invested in a company called Gazelle in the early days of gallium arsenide. It was struggling, and we ended up putting 3 companies together, and it formed Triquint, which is a very successful company up in Oregon now in the gallium arsenide field. Proving that you can tie 3 rocks together and they will float was our analogy there. But there was a guy up there that gave me this idea, and I've used it ever since. And that is that before every board meeting, you got to ask yourself 2 questions. Number 1, should we fire the CEO? Because that's the one person in the company. You are not responsible for the management of the company. You're responsible to have hired a management under a CEO. You always pray the answer to that question is no, that you got the right person. But you got to face, that's your principal responsibility as far as managing the entity. Then the second question is, hoping the first question, the answer is no, is how can I help? If you can't help, you shouldn't be there. I don't believe on a board. And that's help means helping to develop the CEO, helping him pick the right folks, helping them wherever you can. Not that they're going to take all your ideas. You're not there every day. You don't know the thing that well. And that's why things like, for example, I stayed on the Lotus board for only a couple of years, and then I got off because Jim Manzi, he wasn't looking for a board. To have a board to approve leases on buildings and do nothing, that was a waste of time. So that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I always now try to make sure that I understand or for the period when I was actively doing new investments, what role do you want me to play on a board? If you don't really want a board, that's I'm not going to do the investment, but B, I'm certainly not going to sit on the board.
Yeah. How did you get involved in Washington and science and technology policy? What did you find, or what have you found attractive about that?
Well, in 1992, let's face it, the Valley had nothing to do with Washington for all of the 60s, 70s, 80s, you could say into the 90s. because, I mean, what we did overseas, you know, Fred Bialik rewrote portions of the Korean Constitution so that they could have, you know, duty-free kinds of things. So we knew a lot about those companies. But Washington was a long way away. The only thing that Washington was, you know, they put out contracts and people bought things from us, but we didn't do any contracting. There was no ARPA contracts generally in the early days. But you know, so we didn't know our congressman, you know, and that kind of stuff. It had no involvement. In '92, Clinton did something really interesting. He realized that the Valley was different than San Francisco. Everybody used to come, the politicians came to San Francisco, and you'd get the odd invite to attend something up there, but it was in San Francisco. They never came here. And, you know, as I've said in the past, he proved something about a vacuum. Nature abhors it. He filled that vacuum, and the Valley got launched in that direction. In '96, when he was running for re-election, if you recall, tort reform was a big deal. And we did not like all the suits we were starting to get. And the Valley had been discovered by the politicians. And '96 is coming on, and Clinton's coming back. Clinton had vetoed a very important bill to us, and we were not happy. And we had helped a lot of people overcome that veto. The only override in his thing is on tort reform. And so my wife sees an article in the paper and says, that you know, the Valley was backing Clinton again in '96. Well, she didn't like Bill Clinton. She didn't like him in '92. She just thought he was a, you know, fast talker. And so she calls me at work. Now you got to understand, the previous time she'd called me at work was like 1985 when my dad had died. She never interrupted me at the office, ever. I mean, probably I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of times she interrupted me. She talks to my assistant. She says, he's in a meeting. Would you mind interrupting him? I get to the phone, and she says, they're doing it again. And I said, who are they and what are they doing? I'll never forget this conversation. She says, have you seen the front page of the Mercury News? They're saying that the whole Valley is for Clinton. And you know that's not true. And it was largely not true, not because of anything but tort reform. We were really ticked that he'd come up with, you know, backing the tort lawyers on this thing. And then the magic words came out. Floyd, you have got to do something. And Bob Dole, who I didn't know from Iraq, was the candidate. Jack Kemp, who I had met and knew. I was a member of a thing called Empower America, which I'd been talked into by Tom Weisel, which really meant you wrote a check to have, you know, Jack Kemp and Bill Bennett, you know, do their thing on Capitol Hill. But I wasn't that involved, really, at that time. I later became chairman of it. But you know, and so that had just happened earlier in '96, but I'd met Jack Kemp. And so we arranged to have, I found out that Jim Barksdale was a strong Republican. And we arranged to have a Jack Kemp thing at Netscape for the '96 election. Just, this happened in like September of '96. And of course the election didn't go our way, but what I did was I got about 50 leading CEOs in the Valley to back the Dole Kemp group. And actually John Doerr had put together a group for about a dozen from the Valley for their thing. Actually, we ended up with 5 times as many as they, because later then our group grew to about 150, 200, and their group grew to about 40. So the election happens, we win the prop, what was it, 70, whatever it was, tort reform for California. And John comes to my office one day and says, you know, we got to face the fact that we haven't been politically involved at all, but the politicians are starting to find us, and they're going to screw us up if we're not careful. Do you think your Republican group would join the Democrat group that we put together and form an organization to at least have our ideas, and keeping this tort reform thing alive was the principal thing, and attacking the education issue? Do you think they'd do that? And that's how TechNet was born. It was going to be bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats, and there'd be a Democrat arm for fundraisers and a Republican person for fundraisers, kind of thing. And so it got formed in the fall of '96, but didn't have its first meeting until the spring of '97. The first meeting had to do with education, and I attracted Bill Bennett, who I'd worked with in Power America, to come out and talk about it. And I'll never forget what he said, because we were then pushing for a national test for student education, so you could monitor, because Jim Barksdale was big on you can't manage what you don't measure. That was his big thing at the time. And Bill, I'll never forget this. He gets up, he says, "You guys are pushing for a national test. Let me tell you what your problem is. The Republicans hate the word national, and the Democrats hate the word test. You got a problem. This is never going to work." So anyway, but that's how TechNet got started. And as a result of that, we had the whole idea was to have limited number of issues. We went back to Washington and talked about education, and we talked about tort reform. And none of the companies had Washington offices except HP at that time. So it was a new experience for basically everybody in the Valley. 1998 rolls around, and by this time I'm the guy that briefs a lot of the congressmen coming through on the R side. Other guys did it on the D side. And 1998 comes around, and George W. Bush is running for re-election as governor of Texas. And so he comes out here, and it falls my responsibility to fill him in on the issues. Then we're up at Quadras, and he says, so what are the issues? And I told him about the education thing. I told him about the tort reform. By that time, a good thing had happened on the tort reform thing, so that was falling away as an issue. And I don't frankly remember what our other 2 or 3 key issues were at that time. And he says, "Is that it?" After I'd kind of briefly briefed him. We had 10 minutes before the meeting. I said, "Well, no, not exactly, sir." I said, there's a lot of rumor of you running for president. You're going to get that question today. And he looks at me kind of wistfully and says, "Yeah, and I don't know what I'm going to do about that. But you're right, it's being talked about, and I'm starting to think about it." And as a result of that, his being wistful, and then he goes on to tell me, he says, "I know what this does to a family. My daughters are 16, and this is going to be hard for them, because they'll be 18 when I'm in the White House," or whatever it was. I mean, I don't remember the exact times.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
going to college.
Yeah, they were going off to college. And as a result of that, I bet John Chambers a case of wine that George W. Bush would not run, and I bet somebody else a bottle of some fancy champagne that he would not run, And so obviously that was wrong. So the spring comes around, and he's starting to have these lunches in Austin. So he's inviting down 20, 25 people. And so I get invited to one of these because he remembers me from Silicon Valley. And he talked about his campaign. He talked about kids, the No Child Left Behind idea. Well, I don't think it was called that at that time. He talks about some other things that he's thinking about doing. And he's thinking about running, but he wanted to get a feel for people from various sectors. And the luncheon I went to, I think there were 20 people. We sat in a very small room in the governor's mansion. And actually, he sat me right next to him, which I found interesting at the time. And so he talked policy, and the meeting ended, and nothing more, came of it. But at that moment, and then he formally announces. And I get a call and asked if I would set up or help set up a technology advisory board. And many people don't know this, but Bush never set up Greek Americans for Bush, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans for Bush, Black Americans for Bush. He hated hyphenated. He just hated it. He didn't want any of that. So the only advisory board he had was a tech advisory board. And that was his thing, And actually, he asked me to do it with Michael Dell, who I saw the other night at Steve's thing, by the way. I hadn't seen him for a long time. And so Michael was very, very busy with Dell. But Michael had done a wonderful thing before that. He had spent hours with Bush telling him that this tech thing is real and it's going to change the world. And because he was right there in Austin, and they'd become friends. And so Bush was really into this. So then he asked me to set up a thing out here, and then he asked me to set up a thing in Austin, and we brought in 400 CEOs from around the country for a big meeting on what are the issues. We did big papers, and then he joined the meeting. And this is after now he had introduced the thing. And Michael and I, you know, ran the meeting for him, and I did most of the legwork of getting guys there. Because you know, the tech thing was just huge. I mean, it was on the way up to what was the bubble, but the bubble hadn't burst yet. Well, right about this time, we're now into 2000, and the bubble is moving, and it's peaking in that March-April time frame. And you know, so he was very. As a matter of fact, the last time he came here, he wanted to have one of those 1,000 points of light, like his dad had one of those faith-based things here. He didn't want to do tech, but he wanted to meet with tech guys. So I arranged for him to meet John Chambers again, and Scott McNeely had not met him yet, and those two. And Scott had just returned from a sales trip to Detroit, and told him that, and this was like a week before the election, and told him, "This isn't good. You know, things are heading right into the toilet." And you know, of course the NASDAQ has gone from 5,000, and right now it's, by that time it's probably 2,500. I mean, it had fallen a lot in that time frame. So he said, "Well, this is going to be mine if we win this thing, and so I'm going to depend on you guys to help me." Some words of that effect. And I helped arrange a thing. It was over at the San Jose Rescue Mission, because he was doing that faith-based thing, and he was late because he was meeting with these guys who were trying to get off alcohol, and since he had gone through the exact same thing personally, he really related to that program over there. Matter of fact, he talked about it for a long time after that, and was happy that he'd seen that. So the election happens, and if you recall, the election took forever. And so it's very late December or January, I get a phone call, and it's from his buddy Friedman in Southern California, you know, who he'd gone to college with. It's funny, I can't think of his first name right now. But he said, "Would you be interested in an ambassadorship? Is that why you did that?" I said, "No, you know, I didn't do it for that. I just think he's the right guy for the country right now." And so, no, I don't need to have anything. And that was that. About a week goes by, I get another phone call. Oh no, what I said was, I said, "I don't think you have ambassadorships to Silicon Valley, so I don't think I'm interested I don't think I want to do this." And Gene wasn't interested in going overseas. I wasn't particularly interested in doing an ambassador thing either. I'd one time talked about being ambassador to Japan when I was going to Japan so much. I've been to Japan about 70 times. Because of the Hitachi thing and selling semiconductors when they were a big market in the 70s. We didn't go into that. But anyway, so this next call comes back and said there's an advisory board for the president that's in the White House. It's been created in one form or another since Truman. And would you be open to co-chairing that? Now, by this time, there's rumors I'm being considered Secretary of Commerce. And I knew they were false because nobody had talked to me, you know, and that was logically going to somebody that had been heavy in the campaign, and Don Evans, of course, took that role. So I get this call. Well, fortunately, the current guy chairing that was John Young from HP for Clinton. He had done it for 8 years. So I called John, because I knew John very, very well, and said, "John, you know, talking to me about this PCAST thing." And I'd never heard of PCAST at that time. And by now I guess we're through the inauguration by this time. It's just that has just happened, and so I called John, and John's answer was, "Only do it if you think they care," because he said, "You remember?" He says, "I don't know if you know this, Floyd, but the president assigns thousands of people to build an administration and never meets with most of them." And so I tried to figure out how I was going to get the answer to that question. I mean, it's a little hard to say, well, if you appoint me, do you care? You know. So I met with Carl, who I'd gotten to know well in the thing. He said, "No," he said, "tech's a big deal for the president. And he wants to really understand what tech's going to mean, because obviously by now the bubble has burst for sure, and we're in a recession, you know, and he thinks tech's going to be, You know, it was a tech bubble and tech's down, and so we got to figure out what to do about this. And so, long story short, I accepted the job, and in March was named co-chair of PCAST. And they hadn't picked the science advisor, so I was the guy in the White House. I actually had an office in the EEOB, Eisenhower Executive Office Building, right, which is on the White House grounds, that big concrete building next to it. And so I was going back there once a month and helped on Cheney's energy plan, and started to roll out. And what they asked me to do was to meet with each of the cabinet secretaries and say what tech areas would they like advice in. And I kind of asked to do that because I said the concept of giving advice in areas that people don't want it in doesn't appeal to me. I said, let's at least find out what they want advice in.
So this is a fully engaged job.
This is fully engaged.
Window dressing.
No, I'm up to my eyeballs at this time. And I'm the tech guy in the White House for months because Jack Marburger doesn't get appointed until November. Or no, he gets appointed in like August. But congressional, Senate approval takes forever, and my job did not require Senate approval. At first they thought it was going to, but then it didn't. So March, April, May. May we have a big energy conference out here in LA because California is going through that big energy thing. Gray Davis is there, Reardon from mayor of LA, and the president comes out. He asks me to put together a thing. I bring a bunch of the guys from here down, and then they also brought people in from stores. That's where I learned that Walmart controls the temperature in all of their stores centrally in Bentonville, Arkansas, and he agreed to turn the degrees up 2 degrees to lower their air conditioning costs at the meeting, kind of a deal.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. But anyway, it's kind of fascinating. So, I mean, the White House is starting to be like an office, and I have an office there. And I'm getting asked all these questions. Finally, Jack, well, as a matter of fact, I was in Washington walking toward the White House on 9/11 when all hell breaks loose. And I see people running out of the White House building. I'm still chairman of Empower America at that time. We have an office right at kitty corner from the White House. I go up the elevator. I get in the lobby, and there stands Bill Bennett pushing the button to get down the elevator. And I say to Bill, I didn't exactly know what was going on at that time. Bill says, when I was in the cabinet, they told us to get as far away from this city as possible. If there's ever he said, you're in a war zone. And I go back down the elevator, start walking back toward my office, and there's this guy with a bunch of hash on his shoulders, talking to a guy next to him. I'm eavesdropping. He says, my God, I thought I'd never see this air cover over Washington. And there's these low-flying jets, and he explains to this guy, those guys are at 2,000 feet. There's another set of them at 40,000 feet, and if anything gets in between, they ain't going to be there very long. And the city is just nutso, and people are running away, and I go back to my hotel, and I find out I don't have my phone charger. I can't make connection to Jane here, and because the phone lines were all jammed up. And I've realized I've forgotten my phone charger. Go out in the town at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to try to find a store open to buy a phone charger. There are none open. I hear that the president's coming in. I fortunately stayed at the Jefferson instead of the Hay Adams. They were booked up that time. And so everything was blocked off up in the K Street. And I watched the helicopters come in, watched the president land. He was joking with me about that just recently. He says, I thought there was one guy I saw out there because the city was deserted. He has a sense of humor that was incredible, but that was an exciting day. And we were having a TechNet meeting that day or the next day. I guess we were planning on it. Because I worked with a gal that had been the Republican head of TechNet out here, and she got the job of being head of domestic liaison, Leslie Westing. I don't know if you ever heard her name. But Leslie was in the White House working for Carl. And we had worked together on all the Republican deals out here, so that was a relationship back there that was perfect. So she set up all the conferences, and so she always asked me who to invite, and so I got involved, and then I tried to stay on top of what policy issues are you guys really worried about. And the big job there was everybody goes into those things with biases. I mean, they're not going to recommend a policy that's going to hurt their company. So you have to figure out, okay, is this good for Sun, or is it good for America? Or is it good for both? And you try to find the ones that were good for both.
And how do you feel that process works? Can it work pretty well?
I thought it worked very, very well. And now again, we had tremendous access to the president. But the thing he called on us is he said, I know that this hasn't been PCAST's responsibility generally, But if we accept one of your ideas, I want you on the Hill selling it. You have to go up there and meet with the Congress, meet with the senators, et cetera. And two things happened early on in the administration. They had a thing called PTAC, which is the President's Information Technology Advisory Council, which had been developed in the H.W. Bush days. That came up for renewal. Bush didn't want a separate head of that, so he tucked that under us. But that responsibility was also to the Congress. That reported to the Science and Tech Committee in the Congress. And then they wanted to do a similar thing because they really liked the PTAC worked on nanotechnology. Well, we had started a report on nanotechnology at PCAST because that was starting to be a big deal, and they were starting to, you know, some of these folks were into the precautionary principle, if you're familiar with that. We're wanting to stop a lot of the nanotech, and we didn't think that was wise from a scientific development standpoint. So instead of that, and that was in the early years when the Democrats were in control of the Senate, so Ron Wyden was the key guy. So I got to know Ron, and I talked him into allowing that to also report into PCAST or be part of PCAST, and I would chair that as well. So I formally really chaired three things: PCAST, PTAC, and the National Nanotech Advisory Panel, NNAP. And so we had touch with the Congress also on those things. And you know, I don't think many Americans know how close we came to nanotech being really, really stopped in this country.
What would that have, why would that have happened? Because
people, these precautionary principle people were really getting into it. And it was the green movement, it was the GMO movement. They felt that nanotech wasn't properly understood. And you can't say that it is properly 100% understood. But you know, the thing that technology implies is risk. You got to face the fact it implies risk. Everything we do, you know, and particularly in the drug delivery area, and yes, you try to go through phase 1, 2, 3 clinicals to try to eliminate the risk, but you know and I know that there's many examples where drugs, after they got to the market, had to be taken from the market. Does that mean we shut down all drug things until we're absolutely certain? I just didn't feel that that was the right thing to do. And sunscreens, for example, were starting to be applied, essentially all of them were nanotech-based items, and they were worried about, you know, penetration through the dermal layer, and we had to address that, and yeah, we worked closely with the FDA on that report on nanotech, but we concluded that the evidence just didn't support the fact that these were dangerous kinds of things from a policy point of view, and therefore, yes, we had to use a certain amount, and they wanted to legislate the percentage of the funds that were for you know, health and safety. What was it called? There was a word. That was the front words of the environment, health, safety, and efficacy. Those words were worked into a word. I'm having a senior moment on what that was, but that was there. And then, yeah, you know, energy was a big thing, and I ran into the president. This wasn't an informal meeting, back down about 2003 or 4, in a thing in L.A. And he said, "How's it going?" I said, "It's going great." I said, "But by the way, we're thinking about starting a study, if you guys want us to, on entrepreneurs are really getting involved in energy." He said, "They are?" He says, "You mean your crowd of guys out west are getting involved in energy?" I said, "Yeah." And I said, "I think some exciting things might come of that." And he said, "Boy, I want to see that report. Go ahead."
That's something else he's very personally involved in.
Yeah, that he was very personally involved with. And you know, he loved the word entrepreneur. He just really loved it. I mean, if you want to get something from him, tell him entrepreneurs are involved. and that was going to be a sales point. So we start on this study, and we soon see that we got to take a look at the whole thing. And we find that those charts at Livermore that show the flow diagram, and I think we made those famous. Because now everybody wants to look at the flow diagram of energy in the country, but we showed how, you know, the various sectors and how there's really two pieces: transportation and electricity generation. And of course, you know, carbon is becoming an issue, and you talk about where the carbon's coming from and all. And so we talked about solar, we talked about wind, but we face the fact that, you know, these things are a small percentage of our energy thing. And at that time, now we're getting close to 2005. We're using 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy in the country as a whole. projections are 150 by 2030 with with current deal. So we came on very strong for energy efficiency moves, really pushed Energy Star and all those kinds of programs that they should be more broadly applied so consumers knew what energy impacts things were having. And at first, the first thing we did in the early thing that was a takeoff on that thing I'd done in May for energy out here, he asked me to repeat that in Washington at the Department of Energy. And they showed him hydrogen cars. And by that time, you know, I was meeting with the energy guy in Cheney's group. I can't remember his name. I said, you know, that ain't gonna fly, guys. Let's not get the president off. And he had him driving a hydrogen car. I mean, there are so many problems there. That transition isn't going to take place a long time. So I became a big promoter of biofuels as a result of our report. And efficiency, biofuels, more domestic supply, you know, as a way to get at both the carbon issue and the carbon cycle issue and the efficiency issue and the supply issue. And many Americans don't know that in 2005, and so I had an Oval Office presentation with Bush, Cheney, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Agriculture, and the stand-up meeting only. And I mean, you got to have studied your subject before you do that.
Stand-up meeting, everyone comes in and stands.
Well, most of the guys are standing. I'm sitting on one of those couches next to Sam Bodman, who's Secretary of Energy. The President's sitting in that chair just in front of the fireplace. Vice President is sitting. Very rare that you get to get both of them, but this was a big deal, Energy, because he was going to do a big State of the Union thing. And we gave him our pitch, and he was going into a cabinet meeting right after that. He bought into it, and that's when they did the thing for the mandates for ethanol. And nobody thought ethanol would be able to produce the volume that it did. But it did. As a matter of fact, today about 9% of our gas supply, our fuel supply is coming from ethanol. And they bought it. And you know, at that, and I predicted the president, after the meeting I shook his hand and I said, you know, Mr. President, if you do this, you know what year will be the peak year for American imports of foreign oil? He said, no, which one? I said, the one we're in, 2005. And I don't know if you know, but we imported 12.5 million barrels a day in 2005. It went down in 06, it went down in 07, went down in 08, it went down, and today we're importing 9.4 million barrels a day. We're down 25% in oil imports from foreign sources. And we've switched. Canada is now our largest supplier. Mexico is either second or third, Saudi being the other, second or third. So our demand for foreign oil, most Americans don't know this, but it worked, and it was those three things that we pushed. Ethanol, 10% of the supply, more domestic production, and it's up about 10%, and efficiency. And they finally changed the law to where the CAFE standards in fuel standards could be run by the administration, not by the Congress, because the Congress was run. What's the famous Michigan congressman?
John Dingell.
John Dingell. He kept efficiency standards from going up for 20 years. He just fought every time they wanted to raise them, and so it was stuck at wherever the number was, and it didn't need to be stuck. And so that bill went through, and so many people say, you know, are you proud of what you did back there? Some of the stuff they didn't agree with, and nothing happened. But I think of energy, I think of nanotech, I think what we did in personalized medicine to get the HHS going on understanding that drugs are not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. Our bodies, while 98% the same, are different. And things like Herceptin for breast cancer, if you don't have that gene, it's not going to help you. If you do, it's a miracle drug. And so I felt, you know, you just don't get your way every time in these deals. But I felt we made a lot of progress, and I enjoyed it immensely. The president was terrific to us, and like I say, most of the time agreed with. Or if he went with something, he pushed it on the Hill. He pushed it in his budget things, and we got a chance to fight for it on the Hill. They didn't always agree.
So those are all examples of somebody from the private sector with a deep technological background and real credibility in industry coming into Washington and really making a difference.
Oh, trying to, for sure.
Trying to.
Yeah.
Does that give you hope when you look at the way these things sometimes work well together and they sometimes don't?
Yeah, it does in one respect. And I had been dipped into the, feeling that the bureaucrats are a bunch of bumbling boobs. There's a lot of very smart people in Washington. Unfortunately, they can't know everything that's going on in the economy. And they get assigned responsibilities to do things with legislation that is formed because of 6 different entities that, maybe a half dozen companies that are in that area, and it affects everybody in that industry. That's not good. We've got to learn to differentiate legislation from General Electric and General Motors to Mother Fletcher Screen Door and Rocket Factory. It's just, there are different ways to do things, and I got very active. I'll tell you one funny story, actually. This is probably the funniest thing I ever did in Washington. When Sarbanes-Oxley was going through and they were going to change stock option pricing. I mean, stock options had been a part of the Valley since 1960, if not before. And I really, really thought they were making a major mistake on this. And so the guy heading the budget committee was Richard Shelby. This is now probably 2006, something like that, 5, somewhere in that. I didn't know Richard Shelby from a rock, but I knew that Jack Kemp knew him well. I said, Jack, you got to get me an appointment with Richard Shelby. I mean, I was from the president's office and all, and that was all, but I just didn't feel that my title would move him, particularly since I didn't want to talk about technology. I wanted to talk about the impact on technology of a piece of legislation. So we walk into Shelby's office, and I brought Kip Hagopian and Ed Schau with me, because the 3 of us had been working on how to change, on the logic of the accounting that they were going for in this stuff. So it was an accounting issue, but it was going to affect the earnings reports of tech companies. And we knew that he was dead set against what we were asking for, but we wanted to at least have a chance to make our pitch. And so, without telling Kip or Ed, I start off the meeting when Shelby shows up, and you know that Shelby has agreed to this meeting. He's agreed for it to be 15 minutes long, and then he wanted out of there, and he was putting up with these guys. I mean, I just could tell by the look on his face. For 15 minutes, with his good friend Jack Kemp. I mean, that was the deal, and I knew it. So I start off the meeting. I said, Senator, we're here to talk about something that we know you're not very, very big on, and we feel a little like the 3 Hebrew children in a fiery furnace. and I said, I don't know if we're going to get out of this live, but I was trying to get a rise out of him. He didn't even break a smile. It was terrible. His aide is sitting there saying, what the hell did you do that for, But we then made our pitch. We walk out of that room, and Kip, do you know Kip Hagopian?
No, I don't.
He's a venture capitalist. Yeah. He's a venture capitalist, very smart guy in Southern California. He's chairman of Jack Gifford's company. Jack, of course, passed away, but Maxim. But we walk out, and Kip turns to me and says, where the hell did you come up with that 3 Hebrew children? But it just struck me as I sat there, this is not going to go well. I just know it. And when he walked in with that look on his face, I just knew it was fun. And we didn't get our way on that. And I mean, today, think about the situation today. We announce and we are allowed to use non-GAAP numbers for our announcements. Just talk yourself through what that says. We're allowed to use non-generally accepted accounting principles for our numbers. I mean, come on, that's crazy, And so accounting, in my view, is so broken, and that's one we didn't get a chance to change, and it has impact on the tech companies. It certainly has had impact on their ability to access public funds in an IPO way, and I'm saddened by that. So some things we weren't able to get done.
You started out talking about how little the Valley understood Washington, and probably vice versa. Where do you feel that stands now, given how you've seen it up close and personal in both places?
Well, I think TechNet did a great thing, particularly in the early days. Okay. I think TechNet was a very effective entity, particularly in its early days, because it, you know, Washington wanted to hear from the tech leaders because the tech leaders were you know, having an increasing impact on the national economy, so they needed to understand that. Of course, since then, virtually every major company and a lot of small companies have gotten together with Washington offices. And if anything today, there's almost too much tech in Washington, and there's so many associations now that they have to come together, because we don't have the equivalent of the Business Roundtable in tech. We don't have the equivalent of NAM, the National Manufacturers Association, in tech. We have, you know, I think somebody once told me there's 14 of them. And there was even a funny situation at one time early on in my career back there where we learned that, that HP was a member of 10 of them. 4 of them were for a certain piece of legislation, 6 of them were against it. So, I mean, what good was it doing HP? They were saying run, you know, out that way. So I think there's a lot now. I think the question that I was always wrestling with is probably more alive today than it was then, of is this good for HP, or is it good for America, or is it good for both? And that's a hard question to dig into and really totally understand. But we certainly tried, and you know, I would, you know, when you have your own office, that office has its assignment. It's got to be good for Cisco. It's got to be good for Google. It's got to be good for HP. It's got to be good for Apple. It's got to be good for whoever's there, and that's what they're supposed to do for a living. And so somebody, hopefully, in some congressional committee is saying, okay, we've got the opinion of boom, 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 boom. You know, I mean, I met with the head of the. What was his name? The guy who replaced the short guy who was the movie industry guy.
Jack Valenti.
Valenti and his.
And then a congressman, Dan.
I met with him, Dan.
The guy from Missouri.
That's right.
Yeah.
When they were trying to figure out, you know, this whole thing about movies, and
yeah.
I said, hey, you know, I pointed to Steve and said, he did something on music, and you may not like what he did with music, but at least the issue got settled. I think you in the industry have got to bar yourself in a room and figure out how you're going to divide this pie, because the pie doesn't have 150% of pieces. It has 100% of pieces, and you got to sort that out. And that Dan Golden or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah,
yeah.
G. And he never necessarily went along with that, but to me, it'd be awfully nice if those opinions could come up with a common opinion and not have some staffer who's 22 years old recommending what the final legislation is going to look like, because I think we know that that doesn't always work very well.
That's right. Dan Glickman, I think, was
yes,
his name.
that's
yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Very nice guy, very
yeah.
good guy,
yeah.
very concerned guy, and you know, I think he moved on, and I don't know who's there now, but those kinds of issues. When you take all this thing that even the Valley companies were fighting about in this this issue about on the net, open access,
net neutrality.
Net neutrality. I mean, that's an issue that should be solved in the industry, in my view, and I really encourage people to do that, because if you're a guy laying out wire or optical cable and all, if you're not going to get any benefit for having better performance. I mean, let's face it, we had first class and airmail for a long time in this country because there was some benefit for that. You got to sort that kind of stuff out so that the investments will be made and so that this stuff is you know, credible. I mean, fortunately for us, our ability to do DWDM, dense wave distribution, and now putting what, 80 different optical signals on a given fiber, have saved the necessity of doing some of this stuff. But sooner or later, there's going to have to be new infrastructure. And those infrastructure companies better get paid other than being just dumb pipes. Mm-hmm. And so those kinds of things, I was always trying to get industry to, you know, sort it out, or at least come to some logical conclusion before some piece of legislation came in and just screwed the whole thing up.
Would you do it again?
Oh yeah, yeah. I would absolutely do it, particularly under the circumstances that, I mean, because like I told John Young a year after I was there, I ran into him. He says, Floyd, how's it going? I said, John, they care.
The very thing he had
the
said
thing he had talked about.
Watch
Yeah,
out for.
yeah. No, they didn't care about some things. There were certain things we were legislated to do that the administration wasn't particularly interested in, but we had to do them, so we did them, you know. But we didn't spend our time on that. We spent most of our time on doing reports on things that they had said, hey, we'd like to have you look at that. That certainly was the nano case, certainly was the energy case, certainly was the personalized medicine case, certainly was the case when they set up the Department of Homeland Security. We made some recommendations because we had a number of guys that had been follow-ons from both the Bush 41 and the Clinton administrations on our PCAST. We kept a train of people. There was one guy who had been on the Reagan PCAST, one guy had been on the H.W. Bush PCAST, and two guys that had been on the Clinton PCAST in our PCAST. So we had some continuity as well. Yeah.
Well, do you feel at this point now in your career you can see, does this seem like a logical progression to you, Floyd, or have you wound up in places now where you think, yeah, this feels good, this is what I should be doing at this point?
I don't think I look at it that way. I have had a wonderful run. I mean, you know, and I haven't had to do it with a lot of public light. There was a book I read many years ago, something like Reflections of a Bystander. It was by a famous guy, I can't even think who it was, but he was talking about how he, as a young kid, he'd been raised in a family and saw all these people, watched things go on. And so he saw how they developed. And I've always been a bit of a history nut. And so I'm actually reading a book, Citizens of London. I don't know if you've...
I love that book.
Yeah, wasn't it a great book?
It's an amazing book.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff I really like. And I kind of feel like I've been a citizen of the Valley and had a chance to work with some incredible people, know some incredible people, you know, have some influence on what the Valley's done in Washington, you know, watched from the early days, the evolution of the whole thing, and it's been a lot of fun and see people develop. I mean, I have a very, the way I like to say it is, I have a very high view of people. I don't think people are dumb. I was talking to Governor Brown night before last at the Steve Jobs Memorial, and we got to talking about plebiscites and taking things to the folks. I said, well, you know, I don't have a problem with that because I think people are smart. Yes, they're they like to, you know, be gratified, but that's important, you know. I mean, if 80% of the people, 51% of the people, you know, want to see things run a certain way, you don't denigrate the other 49. You don't hurt them in the process, but you know, right things can come out of that. I mean, all the way back to when we had those plants in Southeast Asia that I was mentioning, it just amazed me at the ideas that came out of people that were on those lines. I mean, in Malacca, Malaysia, the previous job of most of our workers was tapping rubber trees. And yet they came into those plants, and within a period of a few years, in our meritocracy promotion system, they were vying for major jobs in a high-tech industry because people are smart. And you just got to keep that in mind. I always hated those books, such and such for dumb. You know, I don't like that title. I mean, like the follow-on ad in 1984, that Lemmings ad, terrible, terrible. It implies your customers are dumb. Whoever buys from me who's dumb? That's a crazy idea. You got to be, you know, you got to have respect for folks, and it served me extremely well. Well,
it's been a privilege to take your oral history, and I'm so glad that you agreed to sit for this, because I know you're not someone in the public eye, and that's not what this is intended to be, but it is intended to be part of the historical record.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Again, I hope it's useful.
Absolutely. No, it will be. So thank you.
Good.